Brother Marcus had been the campanaro of St. Peter's Basilica for 37 years when he first heard the 13th bell. It happened on a Tuesday evening in October, as the autumn mists crept through the Vatican's ancient corridors, like ghostly fingers searching for something lost. He was performing his final rounds, checking the 12 great bells that had faithfully called the faithful to prayer for centuries. Each bell had its own voice, its own temperament. He knew them as intimately as a conductor knows his orchestra. The deep, resonant voice of the campanone, the largest bell weighing over 9 tons. The crystalline chime of San Giuseppe, the warm, maternal tone of Madonna della Guardia. But as he climbed the narrow stone steps that wound up the bell tower, his weathered hands trailing along walls, worn smooth by countless pilgrims and bell ringers before him, he heard something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. A 13th bell was ringing. Marcus paused on the spiral staircase, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. The sound came from above, from a part of the tower he knew contained nothing but empty chambers and forgotten storage rooms. The tone was unlike any of his bells, hollow, mournful, with an otherworldly resonance that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in his bones. He had memorized every inch of this tower, every stone, every shadow, every echo. There was no 13th bell. Yet there it rang, steady and insistent, calling. Calling to what? Marcus forced himself to continue climbing, his legs heavy as lead. The familiar weight of his keyring at his belt felt suddenly inadequate, as if his authority over this sacred space had been revoked by some higher, darker power. The 13th bell grew louder with each step, and with it came a smell, not the clean scent of bronze and oil that pervaded the bell chamber, but something organic and rotten, like flowers left too long in a tomb. When he reached the bell chamber, everything appeared normal at first. His 12 bells hung in their ancient wooden frames, silent now, their bronze surfaces gleaming dully in the lamplight. The mechanisms were clean and well-oiled, just as he had left them that morning. The chamber was empty, except for the familiar tools of his trade and the wooden platform from which he conducted the bells. But the 13th bell continued to ring, and now Marcus could tell it came from directly overhead. Above the main bell chamber was a smaller room, accessible only by a ladder that led to a wooden trapdoor. Marcus had been up there perhaps a dozen times in his decades of service, always finding nothing but dust, cobwebs, and the occasional bat. The space was too small and structurally unsound to house a bell of any size. The ringing grew more insistent, more demanding. Each toll seemed to pull at something deep in Marcus's chest, as if the sound were a rope dragging his very soul upward. His hands shaking, he positioned the ladder beneath the trapdoor and began to climb. The wood creaked ominously under his weight. The trapdoor, which he remembered as requiring considerable effort to open, swung upward at the lightest touch, as if eager to reveal what lay beyond. A gust of frigid air rushed down, carrying with it that putrid floral scent and something else, the unmistakable stench of decay. Marcus pulled himself up into the chamber and immediately wished he hadn't. The room had changed. What had once been an empty space barely large enough for storage was now a vast, cathedral-like chamber that seemed to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the tower. Gothic arches soared into shadows so deep they might have been bottomless chasms. And suspended in the center of this impossible space, held by chains that disappeared into the darkness above, hung a bell of such profound wrongness that Marcus's mind recoiled from the sight of it. The bell was not made of bronze or any earthly metal. Its surface appeared to be carved from bone, human bone. Marcus realized with growing horror as he began to make out the individual skulls and rib cages and femurs that had been somehow fused together to create the instrument. Faces were pressed into the surface, their mouths open in eternal screams, their eye sockets weeping a dark substance that stained the bone black. The bell swung slowly, hypnotically, and with each movement it produced that hollow, mournful tone that had drawn him here. But now, Marcus could hear something else within the sound voices. Hundreds of voices, perhaps thousands, all crying out in agony, all begging for release from whatever torment held them trapped within the cursed instrument. "You hear us," came a whisper from behind him. Marcus spun around to find himself face to face with a figure in papal vestments, but the robes were rotted and stained with centuries of grave dirt, and the face beneath the mitre was nothing but a grinning skull, with eyes like burning coals. "You hear us, as your predecessor heard us, and his predecessor before him. Do you know what this bell is, Campanaro?" Marcus tried to speak, but found his voice had abandoned him. He could only stare at the apparition and nod weakly. "This is the bell of the damned," the figure continued, its voice like the sound of grinding tombstones. "Cast in the year 1348, during the height of the Black Death, from the bones of those who died in mortal sin. For centuries it has hung here, in this space between spaces, calling to the faithful, but not to prayer. Oh no, not to prayer." The ghostly pope gestured toward the bone bell with one skeletal hand. "It calls them to judgment, every soul that has died within the sound of St. Peter's bells, every pope, every cardinal, every simple believer who breathed their last in the shadow of this basilica. They all must face the bell of the damned. And those found wanting." The skull's grin widened impossibly. "They join the chorus." Marcus found his voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Why are you showing me this?" "Because your time as Campanaro is ending," the apparition said, "and every Campanaro must choose. You can continue to serve the 12 bells above, calling the living to worship, ignorant of what lies beneath. Or, the burning eyes fixed on Marcus with terrible intensity, you can serve the 13th bell. You can help us gather souls for the final judgment that is coming." I won't," Marcus stammered. "I serve God, not whatever you are." The ghostly pope threw back his head and laughed, a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. "Serve God? Foolish mortal, who do you think ordered the casting of this bell? When the plague ravaged Europe and filled the graveyards beyond capacity, when even the most faithful began to doubt, the church needed a way to sort the wheat from the chaff. The bell of the damned was blessed by His Holiness Himself, sanctified to serve divine justice." Marcus shook his head violently. No, that's not. God is mercy. God is love. God is judgment," the apparition corrected. "And judgment requires condemnation as much as salvation. The 13th bell ensures that no soul escapes its proper fate." The bone bell's tolling grew louder, more insistent, and Marcus could feel its pull more strongly now. The voices trapped within its ghastly surface seemed to be calling his name, begging him to join them, to add his voice to their eternal lament. He took a step backward, then another, but found his foot met only empty air. He had somehow moved to the edge of a precipice that hadn't been there moments before. Below him yawned a chasm that seemed to extend down through all the layers of the earth, down to the very foundations of hell itself. And rising from those depths came the sound of more bells, dozens of them, hundreds of them, an entire carillon of the damned, ringing out across the underworld. "Choose quickly, Campanaro," the ghost urged, floating closer. "Accept your role as servant of the 13th bell, or take your place among its voices." Marcus closed his eyes and began to pray, the familiar words of the Ave Maria falling from his lips like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. But even as he prayed, he could feel himself being pulled forward, drawn by the inexorable gravity of the bone bell's song. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in the normal bell chamber again, surrounded by his familiar 12 bells. Dawn light was streaming through the windows, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the morning prayers beginning in the basilica below. His clothes were soaked with sweat despite the morning chill, and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the ladder as he descended. For the rest of that day, Marcus tried to convince himself it had all been a dream, a nightmare brought on by too much wine and too little sleep. But as evening approached and he made his way to the bell chamber for the sunset prayers, he found himself pausing at the bottom of the ladder, listening. And in the silence between the tolling of his earthly bells, he could swear he heard it faint but unmistakable, the hollow, mournful voice of the 13th bell, calling from somewhere far above, still waiting for his answer. That night, Marcus wrote his letter of resignation and left Vatican City forever. But sometimes, late at night, in his small apartment, in a distant city, when the wind blows just right through his open window, he can still hear it calling. The 13th bell, patient and eternal, reminding him that some choices cannot be avoided forever. And in the bell tower of St. Peter's Basilica, Brother Antonio, Marcus's young replacement, has begun to notice something strange. Sometimes, when he performs his evening rounds, he could swear he hears a 13th bell ringing from somewhere high above. But that's impossible, of course. There are only 12 bells in the tower, aren't there? Sister Catherine first noticed something was wrong with Brother Paolo on the Feast of All Souls, when she saw him walking across St. Peter's Square at midnight without casting a shadow. She had been returning late from the Vatican Library, her arms full of manuscripts that needed to be catalogued before morning, when she spotted the familiar figure of the bell ringer making his way across the moonlit square. Paolo had been the campanaro for only 6 months, having replaced old Brother Marcus, who had left suddenly without explanation. The young monk was conscientious about his duties, often checking the bells well into the night to ensure they were properly maintained. But as Catherine watched him pass beneath the street lamps that illuminated the square, she realized something was terribly wrong. The light fell across his robed figure clearly, but the cobblestones beneath his feet remained uniformly pale. Where there should have been a shadow, there was nothing. Catherine blinked hard, certain she must be mistaken. But no, as Paolo continued his solitary journey toward the basilica, every lamp he passed confirmed the impossible truth. The man had no shadow. She considered calling out to him, but something in his posture, the rigid set of his shoulders, the mechanical precision of his gait, filled her with an inexplicable dread. Instead, she pressed herself back into the shadows of the colonnade and watched as he entered St. Peter's through a side door, disappearing into the sacred darkness within. The next morning, when she encountered Paolo at morning prayers, everything seemed perfectly normal. His shadow fell across the chapel floor like everyone else's, dark and properly proportioned. When she cautiously asked how his evening rounds had gone, he looked at her with mild confusion. "Evening rounds, sister? I was in my cell by 9 o'clock, as always. I never check the bells after dark. It's far too dangerous to climb those stairs without proper light." Catherine studied his face carefully. Paolo was not a liar. His confusion seemed genuine. Yet she was certain of what she had seen, or rather, what she hadn't seen. Over the following weeks, Catherine began to pay closer attention to the bell ringer. During the day, Paolo appeared to be his normal, dutiful self. He performed his campanological duties with precision and reverence, coaxing beautiful music from the ancient bells that had called the faithful to prayer for centuries. His shadow behaved exactly as shadows should, shortening at midday and stretching long in the evening light. But several times, always after midnight, Catherine glimpsed the shadowless figure making its way through the Vatican grounds. She began to keep watch, positioning herself at her window in the convent where she had a clear view of the path between the residential quarters and the basilica. The shadowless Paolo appeared 3 or 4 times a week, always following the same route, always moving with that same mechanical precision that seemed so unlike his normal, fluid movements. Disturbed by what she was witnessing, Catherine decided to investigate further. She began staying late in the library, which was situated close to St. Peter's, and several times she managed to follow the shadowless figure into the basilica itself. But each time she entered, she found the vast space empty and silent, with no sign of where Paolo might have gone. It was on the feast of St. Cecilia, patron saint of music and church bells, that Catherine finally discovered the truth. She had been following the shadowless Paolo into the basilica when she heard something that made her blood freeze. The sound of bells ringing in a pattern she had never heard before. Not the familiar call to prayer, or the celebratory peals of feast days, but something darker, more complex, a sequence of notes that seemed to form words in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood at a primal level. The ringing came from the bell tower, echoing through the vast space of the basilica with an otherworldly resonance. But it was well past midnight, and Paolo would never ring the bells at such an hour. It would disturb the sleep of everyone in Vatican City and violate every protocol of his office. Catherine made her way through the darkened basilica, following the sound upward through the narrow passages that led to the bell tower. The ringing grew louder as she climbed, but now she could hear something else mixed with the bronze voices of the bells, a human voice, chanting in that same unknown language, weaving words between the metallic tones like a conductor guiding an infernal orchestra. When she reached the bell chamber, Catherine had to cover her mouth to stifle a scream. Paolo stood in the center of the chamber, but it was not Paolo as she had ever seen him. His body was translucent, like smoke given human form, and around him danced shapes that might have been shadows, if shadows could move independently of the objects that cast them. These shadow beings were operating the bells with impossible coordination, pulling ropes and manipulating levers, while the translucent Paolo conducted them with gestures that left trails of darkness in the air. But most terrifying of all was what Catherine saw surrounding the spectral bell ringer, a writhing mass of shadows that seemed to be trying to tear themselves free from their owners. Human shadows, twisted and struggling, with forms that suggested they were screaming, though no sound emerged from their dark throats. As Catherine watched in horror, she began to recognize some of the shadow forms. There was Cardinal Bertoli, who had died the previous month of a sudden heart attack. Sister Mary Margaret from the scriptorium, who had passed away in her sleep just the week before. A dozen others, all people who had died within Vatican City during Paolo's tenure as bell ringer. Their shadows had been stolen from them in death, Catherine realized, and were now enslaved to assist in this midnight ritual. But enslaved to what purpose? The answer came as the bell sequence reached its crescendo. The shadows began to merge together, flowing like liquid darkness toward a point just above Paolo's translucent form. There, hovering in the air, something was taking shape, something vast and terrible that seemed to bend reality around itself simply by existing. Catherine had read enough forbidden texts in her years as a Vatican librarian to recognize what she was witnessing: the summoning of one of the fallen, a being of such profound darkness that it could only manifest in places of great holiness, feeding on the corruption of the sacred. The entity that was taking shape above Paolo pulsed with malevolent intelligence, and as it became more solid, more real, the shadows around it became more frenzied in their movements. The bells rang out in harmonies that hurt Catherine's ears and made her vision blur, as if the very air was being poisoned by their unholy music. And then the thing spoke, its voice like the grinding of tombstones and the whisper of crematory fire. "The harvest grows thin, Campanaro. We require more shadows, more servants for the great work." The translucent Paolo nodded, his movements still carrying that mechanical precision Catherine had observed. "The faithful are too strong here," he replied, and Catherine was shocked to hear that his voice too had taken on that same grinding, inhuman quality. "Their faith protects them, even in death. We must be patient." "Patience is for mortals," the entity replied. "We have been patient for 6 months, while you gather shadows one by one. It is time to accelerate the process. Ring the bells of calling during tomorrow's evening mass. Draw them all to the basilica at once, and we shall have shadows enough to complete our purpose." Catherine didn't wait to hear Paolo's response. She crept backward as quietly as possible, her mind reeling with the implications of what she had witnessed. The bells of calling were a legend, a supposedly mythical sequence of bell patterns that could compel anyone who heard them to approach their source. If such bells truly existed, and Paolo rang them during evening mass, when the basilica would be packed with hundreds of faithful, she had to warn someone, but who would believe such a tale? Cardinals and bishops dealt in theology and doctrine, not in shadowless bell ringers and entities that fed on stolen darkness. The Swiss Guard were trained to handle physical threats, not supernatural ones. As Catherine made her way back through the darkened basilica, she caught sight of her own shadow on the wall, thrown there by moonlight, streaming through a high window. It occurred to her that if Paolo's supernatural patron was gathering shadows of the dead, it might not be long before it began collecting shadows of the living as well. The next evening, as the bells of St. Peter's began to ring out the call to evening mass, Catherine stood in the square with a growing crowd of faithful, all of whom seemed strangely compelled to attend the service. The bell sequence was unlike anything she had heard before, hauntingly beautiful but somehow wrong, like a familiar prayer spoken backwards. She watched the faces around her as they listened to the bells, and saw the same glazed expression settling over all of them. Young and old, clergy and laity, locals and tourists all were moving toward the basilica with the same mechanical precision she had observed in the shadowless Paolo. Catherine tried to resist the pull of the bells, but found her own feet carrying her forward, despite her desperate attempts to turn away. The bells of calling were working exactly as intended, and as she joined the crowd flowing into St. Peter's, she caught a glimpse of her own shadow on the steps. It was flickering, she realized, with growing terror, becoming less solid with each toll of those cursed bells. By the time the great doors of the basilica closed behind the assembled faithful, Catherine's shadow had faded to barely a whisper of darkness at her feet. And high above in the bell tower, something that wore Paolo's face but was no longer entirely Paolo smiled, as it prepared to complete a harvest that had been centuries in the making. The next morning, the Vatican guards found the basilica empty except for a single figure kneeling in prayer before the altar. Sister Catherine was alive and unharmed, but when the morning light streamed through the great windows, it illuminated only her form. Like everyone else who had attended the evening mass, her shadow was gone forever, stolen away to serve masters in a realm where darkness reigned eternal. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, visitors to St. Peter's Square report hearing the faint sound of bells ringing from the tower, accompanied by what sounds like hundreds of voices calling out wordlessly from some unimaginable distance. But the tower is always empty when they investigate. At least, it appears to be empty to eyes that can only see the living. Father Romano Agnelli had always possessed what his grandmother called the sight, the ability to perceive things that existed just beyond the veil of ordinary reality. As a child in the hills of Tuscany, he had seen the spirits of ancient Romans walking the old roads, and the ghosts of medieval pilgrims still making their way toward Jerusalem centuries after their deaths. The Church had taught him to view this gift as both blessing and burden, a tool to be used in service of the divine, but always with great caution. So when Pope Benedict XVI personally requested that Father Agnelli investigate the strange reports coming from the bell tower of St. Peter's Basilica, he accepted the assignment with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The previous Campanaro had left suddenly, and his replacement, Brother Paolo, had begun exhibiting disturbing behavior that culminated in his complete disappearance during what should have been a routine evening service. More troubling still were the accounts from Vatican staff who claimed to hear bells ringing at all hours of the night, not the familiar bronze voices of St. Peter's famous bells, but something else entirely. Something that filled listeners with an overwhelming sense of sorrow and an inexplicable urge to confess sins they weren't even sure they had committed. Father Agnelli arrived at the Vatican on a gray October morning, when the air itself seemed heavy with unspoken grief. As he made his way across St. Peter's Square, he could already sense something amiss in the spiritual atmosphere surrounding the basilica. The usual feelings of peace and sanctity that emanated from the holy site were still present, but underneath them ran a current of anguish so profound it made his chest tighten with sympathetic pain. His first stop was the Vatican archives, where he spent 3 days researching the history of the bell tower and its campanari. What he discovered there chilled him to the bone. The position of bell ringer at St. Peter's, he learned, had an unusually high turnover rate. Dating back to the 15th century, there were records of campanari abandoning their posts suddenly, often leaving behind accounts of supernatural experiences that church authorities had deemed too dangerous to make public. Many spoke of hearing additional bells that didn't physically exist, of seeing figures in the tower that vanished when approached, of being compelled to ring specific sequences that produced effects ranging from healing miracles to mass hysteria among those who heard them. Most disturbing of all was a pattern that emerged from the records. Every 40 to 50 years, a campanaro would simply vanish, leaving behind no trace except for reports from witnesses who claimed to have seen the missing person walking through the tower in the days following their disappearance, walking, but casting no shadow and responding to no attempts at communication. Armed with this knowledge and carrying a satchel full of holy water, blessed salt, and various other implements of spiritual protection, Father Agnelli made his way to the bell tower on his 4th evening in Vatican City. He had timed his visit to coincide with the hour when most of the supernatural activity had been reported, just after midnight. When the barrier between worlds grew thin, the climb up the ancient stone steps was eerily quiet, with none of the usual ambient sounds he expected in such a place. No settling of old wood, no distant traffic from the streets of Rome, not even the whisper of wind through the stone passages. It was as if the tower existed in a bubble of absolute silence, cut off from the normal flow of time and space. When he reached the bell chamber, Father Agnelli immediately understood why previous campanari had found the experience so unnerving. The 12 great bells hung in their wooden framework exactly as they should, their bronze surfaces gleaming dully in the lamplight he carried. But the chamber felt crowded, as if it contained far more than 12 bells. Using his gift of sight, Father Agnelli looked beyond the physical realm and gasped at what he saw. The chamber was filled with bells, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, hanging in impossible configurations that defied the physical laws of space and architecture. They were arranged in tiers that extended both upward and downward beyond his ability to see, creating a vast vertical cathedral of bronze and iron and materials he couldn't identify. Some of the bells appeared to be made of crystal, others of what looked like solidified light or crystallized sound. A few seemed to be constructed from substances that hurt to look at directly, materials that his mind insisted could not exist in the mortal world, and every single one of them was ringing. The sound was unlike anything Father Agnelli had ever experienced. It wasn't the clear, triumphant voice of earthly bells calling the faithful to prayer, but something infinitely more complex and heartbreaking. Each bell seemed to be singing a different song of loss, regret, and longing. Together, they created a symphony of such profound sadness that tears began streaming down the priest's face before he was even conscious of weeping. But as he listened more carefully, Father Agnelli began to understand that these were not random expressions of sorrow. The bells were telling stories, thousands upon thousands of individual human stories of lives cut short, of words left unspoken, of forgiveness never asked for or granted. Each bell, he realized, represented a soul trapped in purgatory, using the only voice available to them to cry out for intercession, for prayers, for someone in the world of the living to remember them and ease their suffering. You can hear them. Father Agnelli spun around to find a figure standing behind him, a young monk in the brown robes of a Franciscan, his face pale but peaceful. The priest's supernatural sight immediately identified the newcomer as a spirit, though one still strongly connected to the physical world. "You must be Brother Paolo," Father Agnelli said, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the overwhelming chorus of purgatorial bells surrounding them. The ghost of the former campanaro nodded sadly. "I tried to resist," he said. "When I first heard the bells of purgatory, I thought I was losing my mind. But the souls trapped there, their need is so great, Father. They have been crying out for centuries, and no one could hear them. No one, except those of us chosen to serve in this tower." "What happened to you, brother?" Paolo gestured toward the impossible array of spectral bells. "I learned to ring them," he said simply. "Not the 12 physical bells that call Rome to prayer, but these the bells that call heaven to remembrance of the forgotten dead. Each sequence I learned to play eased the suffering of dozens of souls, sometimes hundreds. But the more I played, the more the boundary between this world and purgatory dissolved for me. Eventually, he spread his hands, indicating his translucent form. I became more resident there than here." Father Agnelli looked around at the vast array of bells, each one representing a soul in torment. The magnitude of suffering they represented was overwhelming, but so was the possibility of bringing comfort to so many of the dead. "There must be another way," he said. "Some method of helping them that doesn't require sacrificing yourself." Paolo's expression became deeply sad. "That's what I thought, Father. What they all thought. But purgatory is not a place that can be accessed casually. It requires total commitment, total surrender, of one's attachment to earthly life. The Campanaro of St. Peter's has always served two congregations, the living who gather in the basilica below, and the dead who gather in the spaces between spaces, waiting for their final redemption. As if responding to their conversation, the purgatorial bells began to ring with increased intensity. Father Agnelli could now distinguish individual voices within the great chorus, a mother calling for her lost child, a soldier begging forgiveness for lives taken in war, a merchant seeking absolution for a lifetime of small dishonest acts. Each voice was a knife of compassion driven into his heart. "How many?" he asked. "Millions," Paolo replied. "Every soul that has died with venial sin on their conscience, every person who passed from this world with debts of love unpaid and wounds unhealed. They are not damned, Father, but they are trapped, and their only hope lies in the prayers and sacrifices of the living. The bells of purgatory are their way of reaching across the void to beg for intercession." Father Agnelli closed his eyes and tried to think clearly despite the overwhelming symphony of anguish surrounding him. His training in theology told him that what he was experiencing was impossible. Purgatory was not a place that could be accessed by physical means, and the dead could not communicate directly with the living except through divine intervention. But his gift of sight told him otherwise. And more than that, his heart told him that the suffering he was witnessing was real and desperately in need of relief. What would happen, he asked carefully, if no one served as campanaro of the purgatorial bells? Paolo's ghostly form shimmered with what might have been a shudder. The souls would remain trapped longer, their suffering extended indefinitely. Some might eventually find their way to final peace through other means, the prayers of living relatives, masses said in their memory, acts of charity performed in their name. But many would be forgotten entirely, left to endure purgatory until the end of time with no advocate to intercede for them. The weight of this revelation settled on Father Agnelli like a lead shroud. To accept the role Paolo was describing would mean sacrificing his own life, his own chance at earthly ministry and human connection. But to refuse would mean abandoning millions of souls to extended torment. As he wrestled with this impossible choice, Father Agnelli became aware that the purgatorial bells were beginning to arrange themselves into a recognizable pattern. The cacophony of individual laments was resolving itself into a single, unified plea that seemed to address him directly. "Help us. Remember us. Do not let us be forgotten." "There is a third option," Paolo said quietly, as if reading the priest's thoughts. "You could serve part-time, as it were. Ring the bells of purgatory for a few hours each night, then return to your physical existence. It would provide some relief for the souls without requiring your complete sacrifice." "But," Father Agnelli asked, sensing there was more, "but it would also mean living with one foot in purgatory for the rest of your earthly life. You would see and hear things that would make normal human relationships impossible. You would carry the weight of millions of dead souls with you wherever you went, and eventually, the pull of purgatory would become too strong to resist entirely." Father Agnelli looked up at the impossible array of bells, stretching away into spiritual dimensions he could barely comprehend. Each one represented a human being who had once lived and loved and hoped and feared, just as he did. Each one was someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend who had passed from this world with unfinished business in their heart. He thought of his comfortable parish back in Tuscany, of the living parishioners who depended on his ministry, of the simple pleasures of earthly life that he would be giving up. Then he thought of the millions of voices crying out from purgatory, begging for someone to remember them, someone to ease their suffering through prayer and sacrifice. The choice, when he finally made it, felt inevitable. Father Agnelli reached for the rope that controlled the largest of the purgatorial bells, a massive instrument of crystallized starlight that seemed to contain the accumulated sorrow of centuries. As his hands closed around the rope, he felt the boundary between life and death, between time and eternity, begin to dissolve around him. The bell's voice, when it rang out across the spiritual realm, was like the sound of divine mercy itself, deep and resonant, and filled with infinite compassion. And as its echo faded into the spaces between worlds, Father Agnelli heard something that made his sacrifice worthwhile: the collective sigh of millions of souls, finding a moment's peace in their long journey toward final redemption. He was still standing in the bell chamber, still physically present in the world of the living, But part of him now resided elsewhere, in that vast cathedral of suspended souls, where the bells of purgatory rang out their eternal plea for remembrance. And though he did not know it yet, his own name had just been added to the long list of Vatican campanari, who had chosen to serve not just the living, but the dead, as well, shepherds of souls who rang the bells that bridged the gap between earth and eternity, ensuring that no one who had ever lived would ever be truly forgotten. In the years that followed, visitors to St. Peter's would sometimes report hearing beautiful, haunting music coming from the bell tower late at night, not the familiar call to prayer, but something else entirely. Something that filled them with an inexplicable urge to pray for the souls of the departed, to light candles for those who had passed beyond the veil, to remember with love and compassion all those who had gone before. And in purgatory, millions of souls found their suffering eased by the prayers their celestial campanaro had inspired, their wait for final redemption shortened by the bridge of sound that connected their realm to the world they had left behind. The bells of purgatory rang on, as they always had and always would, carrying messages of hope across the infinite spaces that separate the living from the dead. The letter arrived at the Vatican's Apostolic Palace on a rain-soaked November morning, addressed simply to His Holiness, in handwriting that trembled with age and fear. Inside, Cardinal Mancini found 7 pages of closely written script, each word carefully formed, yet betraying the desperate haste of its composition. The letter bore no signature, but the cardinal recognized the stationery. It came from the bell tower chambers where the Vatican's ringers had lived and worked for centuries. Your Holiness, I write this confession knowing that my earthly time grows short, and that the thing which has haunted my nights for 43 years will soon claim me, as it has claimed so many others. I can no longer bear the weight of what I have seen and done in service to God and the darker powers that dwell within these holy walls. My name was Brother Thomas Aquinas. I say was, because I am no longer certain I remain the man who first climbed these tower steps in 1976. I have served as bell ringer of St. Peter's Basilica for over 4 decades, and in that time I have witnessed things that would shake the faith of even the most devout. I came to the Vatican as a young novice, filled with the passion of youth and an unshakable belief in the righteousness of our calling. I was chosen for the bell tower because of my strong back and unwavering schedule qualities that seemed so simple and practical at the time. How naive I was to think that the position required nothing more than punctuality and physical strength. My predecessor, Brother Francis, was ancient when I arrived, a hunched figure with wild white hair and eyes that never seemed to focus on anything in this world. He spoke little during the 3 days he spent training me, communicating mostly through gestures and grunts. But on his final evening, as he prepared to retire to a monastery in the countryside, he grasped my shoulder with surprising strength and spoke words I can still hear echoing in my mind. The bells know things, boy. They remember everything that happens within their sound. Every prayer, every sin, every secret whispered in these halls, it all resonates in the bronze. And sometimes, late at night when the Vatican sleeps, they try to tell you what they've learned. I thought he was merely old and addled. I was wrong. The first few months passed without incident. I learned the rhythms of the bells, the different calls for different occasions. The morning angelus at dawn, the call to noon prayers, the evening vespers, and the solemn toll for Compline that marked the end of each day. The work was physically demanding, but spiritually rewarding, or so I believed. It was during my 4th month in the tower that I first heard them speak. I had finished the midnight toll and was preparing to descend to my chambers when I noticed that one of the smaller bells, the one used for calling the cardinals to private audience, was swaying gently despite the absence of any wind. As I watched, it began to chime softly, so quietly that the sound barely carried beyond the bell chamber. But it wasn't the chiming that made my blood freeze. It was the voice. Emerging from the bronze itself, as clear as if someone stood beside me, I heard the whispered words, "Cardinal Rossini takes gold from the heretics, gold stained with the blood of the innocent." I fled the tower that night, convinced I was losing my mind, but the next morning brought news that Cardinal Rossini had been found dead in his chambers. A fortune in gold coins scattered around his body, and a confession of his dealings with anti-Catholic forces still clutched in his lifeless hand. The bells had spoken the truth. Over the following weeks, I began to listen more carefully to their whispered revelations. They spoke of corruption within the Curia, of cardinals who sold relics to private collectors, of priests who broke their vows of celibacy and poverty. Every whisper proved accurate. Every secret they revealed was confirmed by subsequent events. I told myself I was serving God by listening to these revelations, that I was helping to purify the church from within. When the bells whispered of Bishop Marconi's embezzlement of funds meant for orphanages, I found ways to ensure the proper authorities discovered the evidence. When they spoke of Father Vittorio's unspeakable acts with the children in his care, I made certain that justice was served. But as the months turned to years, I began to realize that the bells demanded something in return for their revelations. It started small. A bell would refuse to ring unless I performed certain rituals, lighting specific candles, reciting prayers in languages that predated Christianity, sometimes fasting for days before important ceremonies. I told myself these were tests of faith, trials that God was placing before me. The truth was far more sinister. The bells were not serving God at all. They were servants of something much older, something that had been trapped within the bronze when the bells were first cast centuries ago. Each secret they revealed, each corruption they exposed, fed their growing power. They were using me as their instrument to spread chaos and distrust within the church. And I was helping them. The breaking point came in my 7th year as bell ringer. Pope John Paul I had recently died under mysterious circumstances, and the College of Cardinals had gathered to elect his successor. The bells had been whispering for weeks about the upcoming conclave, revealing the secret allegiances and hidden sins of the cardinal electors. On the night before the voting began, as I performed my evening duties, the bells began to speak with unprecedented clarity. But this time, they weren't revealing the sins of others. They were speaking of my own future. "Ring us wrong tomorrow," they whispered, their voices harmonizing in unholy chorus. "When the white smoke rises, when the new pope is announced, ring the sequence of the damned. 13 chimes, then 7, then 3. Ring the pattern, Thomas, and we will grant you power beyond imagination." The sequence of the damned, I knew it from my studies of medieval demonology, a bell pattern once used in black masses to invoke demonic powers. The bells wanted me to curse the new pope's election, to taint the entire ceremony with their evil influence. I refused. That night, the bells' whispers turned to screams. They raged and pleaded, threatened and cajoled, but I stood firm in my refusal. I spent the hours before dawn in prayer, begging God to give me strength to resist their influence. When Cardinal Wojtyla was elected Pope John Paul II, I rang the traditional pattern of celebration with hands that shook with exhaustion and fear. The bells obeyed, but their bronze voices carried a note of malice that chilled me to the bone. My defiance had consequences. From that day forward, the bells became my tormentors rather than my confederates. They would ring at random hours, disrupting the Vatican's schedule and earning me reprimands from my superiors. They would refuse to sound when needed, leaving me to explain why the call to Mass had failed to ring across St. Peter's Square. But worse than their disobedience was their new form of revelation. Instead of exposing the sins of others, they began to whisper of future tragedies, deaths that had not yet occurred, disasters that were yet to come. They spoke of the attempt on Pope John Paul II's life months before it happened. They described in detail the fall of the Berlin Wall years before the first crack appeared in the concrete. And they demanded that I act on their knowledge. "Warn the Holy Father," they would whisper. "Tell him of the Turkish assassin who will come in May. Save his life, Thomas, and we will forgive your earlier defiance." But I had learned not to trust their offers. I knew that any action I took based on their whispers would somehow serve their dark purposes. So I remained silent, even when I knew I could save lives, even when I knew my inaction would result in suffering. The guilt of my silence has eaten at my soul for decades. As the years passed, I aged far beyond my natural span. The constant exposure to the bell's malevolent influence was consuming me from within, leaving me gaunt and hollow-eyed. My hair turned white before my 40th birthday, and my hands developed a permanent tremor from the spiritual poison that flowed through the bronze I touched each day. Other bell ringers came and went. The position seemed cursed, with most lasting only a few years before requesting transfer or simply disappearing in the night. I alone remained, bound to the tower by forces I could not escape, because I had learned the terrible truth. The bells were not just influenced by evil, they were alive with it. Centuries ago, when the bells were first cast for St. Peter's Basilica, the bronze had been mixed with metal recovered from a much older source. Roman coins taken from pagan temples, golden idols melted down from conquered peoples, silver artifacts that had been used in ritual sacrifice, all of it had been incorporated into the sacred bronze in a misguided attempt to transform evil into good. But evil is not so easily transformed. It merely lies dormant, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The bells had become a prison for dozens of malevolent entities, spirits of rage and corruption that had been worshipped in the dark days before Christianity came to Rome. They whispered through the bronze, fed on the spiritual energy of the faithful who gathered below, and slowly grew in power with each passing century. And I had become their unwilling acolyte. Last week, the whispers changed again. For the first time in decades, the bells spoke not of the past or future, but of the present moment. "Your time is ending, Thomas," they said with voices like grinding metal. "We have found another to serve us, one younger and stronger than you have become. But first, you must perform one final service." They showed me visions then, horrible images of what they wanted me to do. They wanted me to ring the bells during the Pope's next public appearance, to use a specific pattern that would somehow open a gateway for their full manifestation in our world. I will not do it. I cannot do it. Instead, I write this confession as my final act of defiance. By the time you read these words, I will have destroyed the mechanism that allows the bells to be rung from the tower. I have spent weeks preparing a mixture of holy water, blessed salt, and iron filings, the only substances, I believe, capable of disrupting the malevolent forces within the bronze. I know this act will cost me my life. The bells have made that clear. But perhaps my sacrifice will buy time for someone wiser than I, to find a permanent solution to the evil that lurks within these holy towers. Forgive me, Holy Father, for my years of silence and complicity. Forgive me for the warnings I did not give, the lives I could have saved, but chose not to in order to deny the demons their victory. And please, I beg you, find someone with the knowledge and courage to properly consecrate the bells of St. Peter's. Melt them down if necessary, for they have become corrupted beyond redemption. The next bell ringer must not face what I have faced. The Church must be protected from the evil that I have enabled through my weakness and fear. May God have mercy on my soul. A servant of the tower. Cardinal Mancini finished reading the letter as the evening bells began to toll across Vatican City. But something was wrong with the sound. The familiar bronze voices were harsh and discordant, carrying undertones that made his skin crawl. He immediately ordered a search of the bell tower, but they found only an empty chamber and a pile of ash where the bell-ringing mechanism had once stood. The bells themselves remained intact, but they no longer responded to any earthly attempt to ring them. The next morning, the Vatican appointed a new bell ringer, a young priest named Father Alessandro, fresh from seminary and eager to serve. As he climbed to the tower for his first shift, he hummed a hymn and looked forward to the simple, sacred duty of calling the faithful to prayer. He did not notice that the largest bell had begun to sway gently in the windless chamber, or that words were slowly appearing in the bronze itself, etched by invisible hands. "Welcome, Alessandro. We have been waiting for you." The bells of St. Peter's had found their new servant, and their whispers began again, soft and seductive, in the darkness of the tower. The cycle would continue, as it had for centuries, until someone found the courage to silence the bronze voices forever. But that day would not come soon, for the bells had learned patience in their long captivity, and they knew that time was always on their side. Father Giuseppe Benedetti had always found solace in the bells of St. Peter's Basilica. For 12 years, he had served as one of the Vatican's bell ringers, a position that required not just physical strength, but spiritual dedication. The bells were more than bronze and steel. They were the voice of God, calling the faithful to prayer, marking the sacred hours, announcing the most momentous occasions in the life of the Church. But on the night of October 13th, Giuseppe discovered that some bells should never be rung. It began with a routine maintenance inspection of the bell tower. Cardinal Toretti had mentioned strange reports from visitors, whispers of an eighth bell that could be heard during the early morning hours, though only 7 bells hung in the tower. Giuseppe dismissed it as the acoustics playing tricks, perhaps echoes bouncing off the ancient stones in unusual ways. As he climbed the narrow spiral staircase that night, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls, Giuseppe felt an unusual chill. October in Rome was mild, but the air in the tower seemed to carry the bite of a winter that had lasted centuries. His breath misted as he reached the bell chamber, something that had never happened before. The 7 bells hung in their traditional arrangement, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Campana di San Pietro, the largest, dominated the center, flanked by the others in descending order of size. Giuseppe knew each bell intimately, their voices, their quirks, the precise angle needed to achieve the perfect tone. But tonight, something was different. In the far corner of the chamber, shrouded in darkness that seemed to resist his lantern's light, hung an 8th bell. Giuseppe's blood turned to ice. He had been in this chamber thousands of times. Every stone, every beam, every inch of space was familiar to him. The 8th bell hadn't been there that morning. It couldn't have been installed without his knowledge. He was the senior bell ringer, responsible for all maintenance and modifications. The bell was unlike the others. While the 7 traditional bells gleamed with the warm patina of blessed bronze, this one seemed to absorb light. Its surface was matte black, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Strange script spiraled around its circumference, characters that seemed to writhe and shift when Giuseppe tried to focus on them. He approached slowly, his rosary clutched in his free hand. As he drew closer, he could make out more details that filled him with dread. The bell's surface wasn't smooth, it was covered in raised images that told a horrifying story. Scenes of torment, of souls in agony, of things that should not exist crawling through flames that cast no light. At the base of the bell, barely visible in the dancing shadows, was a single word carved in Latin: Infernum, hell. Giuseppe backed away, his mind racing. This was impossible. Blasphemous. The Vatican was holy ground, blessed and protected by centuries of prayer and sacrifice. No infernal object could exist here, let alone in the very heart of the basilica's bell tower. But as he stared at the unholy bell, a voice whispered in his mind, not heard, but felt, like ice water injected directly into his thoughts. Ring me. Giuseppe fled. He stumbled down the staircase, his lantern forgotten, leaving him to navigate by touch and memory. Behind him, he could swear he heard the faint sound of bronze against bronze, as if the cursed bell was moving, swaying in a wind that didn't exist. He burst into Cardinal Toretti's chambers at 3 a.m, wild-eyed and babbling about the 8th bell. The cardinal listened with growing concern, not for the supernatural implications, but for Giuseppe's mental state. Exhaustion, stress, perhaps the onset of a breakdown, these were things that could be treated, managed. Giuseppe, the cardinal said gently, you've been under tremendous pressure. The anniversary celebrations, the increased schedule, the extra responsibilities. Your Eminence, you must believe me. There is a bell in that tower that should not exist. It bears the mark of hell itself. Cardinal Toretti sighed. Very well, we'll examine the tower together at first light. But I want you to see the Vatican physician. Promise me. Giuseppe nodded frantically. He just needed someone else to see it, to confirm he wasn't losing his mind. Dawn broke gray and cold over Vatican City. Giuseppe and Cardinal Toretti climbed to the bell chamber together, accompanied by Father Martinez, the young priest who served as assistant bell ringer. Giuseppe's hands shook as they reached the top of the stairs. The bell chamber looked exactly as it should. 7 bells hung in perfect formation, their bronze surfaces gleaming in the morning light, streaming through the narrow windows. The corner where Giuseppe had seen the 8th bell was empty, occupied only by maintenance tools and coils of rope. Giuseppe, Cardinal Toretti said softly, there are only 7 bells. There have always been only 7 bells. But it was here, Giuseppe insisted, rushing to the corner. Right here. Black bronze carved with hellish images. He stopped. On the floor, where the 8th bell should have hung, was a single black feather. But not the black of a raven or crow. This was the black of absolute void. the absence of all light and hope. As Giuseppe bent to pick it up, it crumbled to ash at his touch. Father Martinez crossed himself. "Perhaps we should—" "No," Cardinal Toretti interrupted firmly. "Giuseppe needs rest, medical attention. Father Martinez, you'll take over bell duties until further notice." Giuseppe wanted to protest, but exhaustion weighed on him like lead. Perhaps the cardinal was right. Perhaps he had imagined it all. Stress could cause hallucinations, couldn't it? He'd heard of such things, but as they left the chamber, Giuseppe glanced back one more time. For just an instant, in the corner of his eye, he saw it, the outline of the 8th bell, translucent but unmistakably there, swaying gently as if recently struck. 3 days later, Father Martinez was found dead in the bell chamber. The official report listed heart failure as the cause of death, a young, healthy priest, but these things happen sometimes. Stress, perhaps an undiagnosed condition. What the report didn't mention was the expression of absolute terror frozen on Martinez's face, or the fact that his body was found directly beneath where Giuseppe claimed to have seen the 8th bell. Giuseppe attended the funeral, but his mind was elsewhere. During the service, as the 7 bells tolled for the dead, he heard it faint but unmistakable, the sound of an 8th bell, deeper and darker than the others, its voice carrying notes of anguish and despair. He was the only one who seemed to hear it. That night, Giuseppe returned to the tower. He had to know the truth, had to prove he wasn't insane. He climbed the stairs slowly, steeling himself for what he might find. The 8th bell was waiting for him. It hung in the same corner, more solid now, more real. The hellish carvings seemed to move in the flickering light of his candle, telling their story of damnation and suffering. But now Giuseppe could see something he had missed before. Among the tortured figures carved into the bronze were faces he recognized. Father Martinez's face, twisted in eternal agony, was clearly visible near the bell's rim. "You see now," the voice whispered in his mind, and Giuseppe realized with growing horror that it was Martinez speaking. "You understand what this is." Giuseppe's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, staring up at the impossible bell. "What do you want?" "To be rung," came the reply, and now Giuseppe could hear other voices joining Martinez's, dozens of them, hundreds, all speaking in unison. "We have waited so long. So many souls trapped here, unable to rest. Ring the bell, Giuseppe. Set us free. Free you? Or damn myself." Laughter echoed through his mind, cold and bitter. "What do you think?" Giuseppe struggled to his feet. "I won't do it. I won't ring that abomination." "Then you'll join us anyway," the voices replied. "Look around you, Giuseppe. Look at what you failed to notice." Giuseppe turned, and his blood froze. The 7 blessed bells of St. Peter's were changing. Their bronze was darkening, their surfaces becoming rough and scarred. Hellish symbols were appearing on their surfaces, spreading like a cancer. The holy bells of the Vatican were being corrupted, transformed into instruments of damnation. "Every day you delay, every hour you deny us, we grow stronger," the voices explained. "Soon, all 7 bells will be like us. And when they ring, calling the faithful to prayer, they will call them to something else entirely." Giuseppe saw the trap now. The 8th bell wasn't just a vessel for damned souls, it was a conduit, a cancer that would spread until all the Vatican's bells became instruments of hell. If he rang it, he would damn himself but potentially stop the corruption. If he didn't, the entire basilica would eventually fall under its influence. "There has to be another way," he whispered. "Ring the bell, Giuseppe," the voices pleaded. And now he could hear the genuine anguish in them. "End our suffering. End yours." Giuseppe approached the 8th bell slowly. As he reached for the rope that would strike it, he began to pray not the formal prayers of the church, but desperate, personal pleas for guidance, for strength, for forgiveness. His hand closed around the rope. The bell rang once, its voice deeper than thunder, darker than the space between stars. The sound seemed to come not just from the bronze, but from the earth itself, from the deepest places where light never reached. Giuseppe screamed as agony beyond description tore through his body and soul. He felt his life, his very essence, being drawn into the bell, joining the countless others trapped within its hellish bronze. But as the darkness claimed him, he realized something the voices hadn't told him. The corruption hadn't stopped. If anything, it was accelerating. The next morning, Cardinal Toretti found the bell chamber empty of people but full of sound. All 8 bells for now, there were clearly 8. Though he could have sworn there had been 7 the day before, were ringing by themselves, their voices creating a harmony that made his soul ache with despair. On the floor lay Giuseppe's cassock, but no body. Just the clothes, as if their occupant had simply vanished. Pinned to the cassock was a note in Giuseppe's handwriting. "The bells are no longer ours. Whatever you do, don't let them ring for Mass." But it was too late. The automated system was already engaging, preparing for the morning call to prayer. Cardinal Toretti ran for the controls, but the bells were already beginning their sequence. Not the joyful peals that had called the faithful for centuries, but something darker, more seductive. All across Rome, people heard the bells and felt compelled to come to St. Peter's. They walked like sleepwalkers, their eyes empty, their faces peaceful. By the thousands they came, drawn by the sound of 8 bells that sang not of heaven, but of the paradise that existed in the deepest circles of hell. Cardinal Toretti watched from his window as they filled the square below, all of them looking up at the basilica with expressions of beatific expectation. He tried to call for help, to warn someone, but found he couldn't move. The bell's song was in his mind now, promising rest, promising peace, promising an end to all suffering. In the bell tower, 8 bronze voices sang their siren song, and among them, barely audible but definitely there, was the sound of Giuseppe laughing, not with joy, but with the bitter knowledge that his sacrifice had been meaningless. The bells of St. Peter's had fallen to hell, and they would ring forever. Brother Thomas Aquilano had never wanted to be a bell ringer. In fact, he had specifically requested any other duty when he first arrived at the Vatican. The idea of being alone in those ancient towers, surrounded by tons of bronze that could crush a man without effort, filled him with a primitive dread that had nothing to do with faith or reason. But the Church had ways of placing people where they were needed, not where they wanted to be, and apparently, Thomas was needed in the bell towers. "It's only temporary," Monsignor Castiglione assured him. "Brother Francesco is recovering from his accident, and we need someone to handle the night duties. You'll ring the bells for Compline, and then keep watch until lauds." Simple enough. Thomas nodded reluctantly. The accident had been the subject of much whispered conversation among the junior clergy. Brother Francesco had been found at the bottom of the bell tower's stairs, claiming that something had chased him. When pressed for details, he would only say that the bells rang themselves, and that someone else was doing the ringing. Francesco was now under the care of the Vatican's medical staff, sedated and resting. Officially, he had suffered a nervous breakdown brought on by overwork and isolation. Unofficially, many of the older priests crossed themselves when his name was mentioned. Thomas's first week passed without incident. The routine was simple enough. Climb the tower at 8 p.m. for Compline. Ring the bells at the prescribed times throughout the night, and keep a general watch over this section of the Vatican until dawn. The isolation was unsettling, but Thomas found he could occupy his mind with prayer and meditation. It was during his second week that he first heard the other bell ringer. He was in the tower of the Apostolic Palace, having just finished ringing for matins at 3 a.m. As he prepared to descend to his small watchroom, he heard the distinct sound of bells ringing from the direction of St. Peter's Basilica. Not the scheduled ringing, this was different, almost playful, like someone experimenting with different combinations and rhythms. Thomas paused on the stairs, listening carefully. The ringing continued for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. He waited, but heard nothing more. The next night, it happened again. This time, Thomas was ready. He had brought a small pair of binoculars, and when he heard the unauthorized ringing begin, he rushed to the window that faced St. Peter's. The basilica's bell tower was clearly visible in the moonlight, and Thomas could make out a figure moving in the bell chamber. Someone was indeed there, pulling the ropes, causing the great bells to sing in the darkness. But who? And why wasn't it being reported? Thomas watched the figure work. Even at this distance, he could tell there was something odd about the way they moved. Too fluid, too quick, as if they weren't quite subject to the same physical limitations as everyone else. The bells rang in complex patterns that Thomas had never heard before, beautiful, haunting melodies that seemed to tell stories without words. When the ringing stopped, Thomas kept watching. He saw the figure move to the window and look out across the Vatican grounds. Even through the binoculars, Thomas couldn't make out features clearly, but he had the distinct impression that the figure was looking directly at him. They stood like that for several long moments, two bell ringers, separated by distance and darkness, observing each other. Then the figure raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning, and stepped back into the shadows. Thomas reported the incident the next morning. Monsignor Castiglione listened with a frown, then made several phone calls. The responses he received seemed to puzzle him. "Brother Thomas," he said finally, "there was no one in St. Peter's bell tower last night. The chambers are kept locked after evening prayers, and security reports no unusual activity. But I saw someone," Thomas insisted. "Clear as day or night, rather. Someone was ringing those bells. The security recordings show nothing. Perhaps you heard echoes from your own tower? Sound can play tricks in these old buildings." Thomas wanted to argue, but what could he say? That he had seen a ghost? That the Vatican was somehow unaware of unauthorized bell ringers operating in its most sacred spaces? That night, he watched more carefully. Again, the bells of St. Peter's began to ring around 3 a.m., but this time, Thomas had positioned himself to observe both the sound and the supposed source. What he saw made his faith in his own sanity waver. The bells were definitely ringing. He could hear them clearly, see the slight vibration of the tower itself as the massive bronzes moved. But the bell chamber appeared to be empty. No figure moved in the shadows. No rope swayed with human touch. Yet, the bells rang with the same complex, beautiful patterns as before. Thomas watched in fascination and growing dread as the invisible ringer worked through an elaborate sequence. The melodies were unlike anything in the church's musical traditions, older, more primitive, but also more sophisticated in their harmonic relationships. They spoke of longing, of searching, of someone or something trying to communicate across a vast distance. When the ringing stopped, Thomas continued to watch the empty chamber. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. But somehow, he knew he was still being watched in return. Over the following nights, Thomas began to anticipate the mysterious ringing. He found himself staying alert around 3 a.m., waiting for it to begin. When it did, he would stop whatever prayers or meditations he had been performing and simply listen. The patterns were becoming familiar. He began to recognize recurring themes, like a musical signature. And slowly, incredibly, he began to understand what the invisible ringer was trying to say. The melodies were a form of communication, a language expressed through bronze and rhythm. The message was simple but desperate. "Help me," Thomas started responding. Using his own bells, he would ring back simple acknowledgments, letting the other ringer know they were being heard. The responses were immediate and enthusiastic, as if the invisible presence had been waiting years for someone to finally understand. Night after night, they conducted their strange conversations. Thomas would ring a question, a simple pattern that asked, "Who are you?" and receive complex responses that told stories of loneliness, of being trapped, of existing between one world and another. Gradually, Thomas pieced together the story. The other ringer had once been human, a bell ringer like himself, but something had happened, an accident, a moment of carelessness or bad luck that had ended their mortal life but not their devotion to duty. They remained in the tower, continuing to ring the bells, unaware that they were no longer among the living. The tragedy of it broke Thomas's heart. Here was a soul so dedicated to their calling that death itself couldn't stop them from performing their duties. But trapped between worlds, unable to move on, slowly going mad from isolation, and the growing realization that something was terribly wrong, Thomas began to research the tower's history. In the Vatican's archives, he found records dating back centuries, detailed accounts of every bell ringer who had served in St. Peter's. Most had left records of their service transfers to other duties, retirements, deaths with proper burials and masses said for their souls. But one name stood out: Brother Antonio Galvani, who had served as head bell ringer from 1823 to 1847. His service record simply stopped mid-sentence, with no explanation of what had happened to him. There was no death certificate, no record of transfer, no mention of retirement. It was as if he had simply vanished from all official records. Thomas dug deeper. In the private journals of priests from that era, he found scattered references to strange incidents in the bell towers. Bells ringing at odd hours. Tools moved from where they had been left. A sense of being watched while working in the towers. And gradually, the growing belief that Brother Antonio had suffered some kind of accident and that his spirit remained tied to his beloved bells. The entries stopped after a few years. Either the phenomena had ended, or people had simply stopped talking about them. But Thomas now understood what had happened. Antonio had been the night ringer for nearly a quarter century. The towers had become his world, his identity so completely tied to the bells that even death couldn't separate them. But somewhere along the way, the other clergy had stopped hearing him, stopped acknowledging his presence. He had become truly invisible, trapped in a routine that no longer served any purpose, slowly losing himself to madness and despair. Thomas made a decision. The next night, when the ringing began, he didn't just listen or respond. He left his own tower and made his way through the dark Vatican corridors to St. Peter's Basilica. The door to the bell tower should have been locked, but it stood slightly ajar. Thomas climbed the stairs slowly, guided by the sound of ringing bells above. As he ascended, the temperature seemed to drop, and his breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air. He reached the bell chamber to find it exactly as his binoculars had shown him, empty, yet alive with the movement of ropes and the singing of bronze. The bells swayed and rang of their own accord, operated by hands that cast no shadow and left no mark on the physical world. "Brother Antonio?" Thomas called softly. The ringing stopped immediately. The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. "Brother Antonio," Thomas continued, "I know you're here. I've been listening to you. I understand." A shape began to form in the shadows near the largest bell. At first, just a distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from summer pavement, then gradually becoming more solid, more human. An elderly man in the robes of a monk, his face kind but infinitely sad, his hands still positioned on bell ropes that existed in whatever realm he now inhabited. "You can see me," Antonio said, and his voice seemed to come from a great distance, echoing strangely in the chamber. "It's been so long since anyone could see me. How long have you been here?" "Time. It's difficult to say. Sometimes it feels like days, sometimes like centuries. I remember falling. There was an accident, I think. I was adjusting one of the bells, and something went wrong. But when I tried to leave, to seek help, I found I couldn't. The tower wouldn't let me go." Thomas nodded. "You love this place too much. Your dedication keeps you bound here. I tried to keep ringing the bells, to maintain my duties. But gradually, people stopped responding. The other brothers would walk right through me. The bells I rang made no sound they could hear. I began to think I was going mad." "You're not mad," Thomas assured him. "You're just displaced, caught between worlds." Antonio's form solidified further, becoming more real with each word of acknowledgement. "Then you believe I'm truly here?" "I know you are. The question is, what do you want? What do you need to find peace?" The ghostly bell ringer looked around the chamber with deep love and deeper sadness. "I need to ring the bells one last time. Really ring them, so that everyone can hear. I need to say goodbye properly." Thomas understood. "The Angelus at dawn. Ring it with me. Both towers together. Let the whole Vatican hear you one final time." Antonio smiled, and for a moment the sadness lifted from his features. Yes, that would be perfect. They waited together as the night slowly gave way to dawn. Thomas had never realized how comforting it could be to share his vigil with another person, even one who existed mostly in memory and devotion. Antonio told stories of the Vatican as it had been decades ago, of bell ringers and their traditions, of the joy he had found in calling the faithful to prayer. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern windows, Thomas and Antonio took their positions. Thomas at the ropes that controlled the physical bells, Antonio at his own ethereal set that existed in whatever dimension he inhabited. At exactly 6 a.m., they began the Angelus. The sound that filled the air was like nothing Thomas had ever heard. 2 sets of bells, one earthly and one spiritual, creating harmonies that seemed to open doorways between worlds. The music carried not just the traditional call to prayer, but messages of love, dedication, and peaceful farewell. All across Vatican City, people stopped what they were doing to listen. Cardinals paused in their morning preparations. Guards looked up from their posts. Even the Pope himself stepped onto his balcony to better hear the extraordinary music. As the final notes faded, Thomas looked around the bell chamber. Antonio was still there, but fainter now, his form becoming translucent. "Thank you," the ghost whispered. "I can go now. I can rest." "Wait," Thomas called, but Antonio was already fading. "Take care of them," Antonio said, gesturing to the bells. "They have voices, you know. Listen carefully, and they'll teach you their songs." And then he was gone, leaving only the morning light and the gentle swaying of bronze bells settling back to silence. Thomas never saw Antonio again, but he was no longer alone in the towers. The bells themselves had become his companions, each one possessing its own personality and voice. They taught him melodies he had never learned, showed him harmonies that existed nowhere in written music. And sometimes, very late at night, when the Vatican slept and only Thomas kept watch in the ancient towers, he could swear he heard a faint echo of another bell ringer, somewhere far away, finally at peace, and ringing bells in a place where the music never ends. Sister Maria Benedetta had never expected to become a bell ringer. Women weren't traditionally given such duties in the Vatican, but times were changing, and the Church was slowly adapting to a new world. When the position opened due to Brother Paolo's sudden retirement, he'd left the Vatican overnight, claiming he couldn't bear the voices anymore. Cardinal Toretti had made the unconventional decision to assign it to Maria. "You have a musical background," he'd explained. "And frankly, sister, you're the only person who volunteered for the position after recent events." Maria knew about the recent events. Every member of the Vatican's community did, though no one spoke of them openly. 3 bell ringers in 5 years had suffered what the medical staff diplomatically termed nervous exhaustion. All 3 had reported the same symptoms before their breakdown: hearing voices in the bells, seeing figures in the tower, and an overwhelming sense that something was watching them. But Maria was practical by nature. She had studied psychology before taking her vows, and she understood how isolation and stress could create hallucinations. The previous bell ringers had been elderly men, set in their ways, perhaps susceptible to suggestion, and prone to see patterns where none existed. She was different, younger, educated, approaching the position with fresh eyes and a rational mind. Her first month in the position passed smoothly. The work was physically demanding but spiritually rewarding. Each bell had its own character, some eager to sing, others requiring coaxing, all of them responding to her touch, like instruments in a vast orchestra. She learned their voices, their moods, the precise amount of force needed to draw the perfect tone from their bronze throats. The tower itself was magnificent, a testament to centuries of devotion and craftsmanship. During the day, sunlight streamed through narrow windows, illuminating the ancient stones and casting everything in warm, golden light. At night, moonlight and starlight created a different kind of beauty, mysterious and contemplative. Maria established a routine: morning prayers at dawn, followed by the Angelus, regular intervals throughout the day for the canonical hours, evening vespers as the sun set over Rome, and then the long, peaceful hours of the night watch, when she would sit in meditation or quietly study theological texts by lamplight. It was during her second month that she first noticed the inconsistency in the bells' voices. She was ringing the Angelus one morning when she realized that the largest bell, Campana di San Pietro, sounded different from the day before. Not damaged or out of tune, but older somehow, as if it carried the weight of more years than it should. Maria examined the bell carefully, running her hands over its surface, checking for cracks or other signs of wear. The bronze was smooth and unmarked, its patina exactly as it should be for a bell cast in 1786. But when she rang it again, she heard the same thing: an extra depth, a resonance that seemed to echo from centuries deeper than the bell's actual age. Over the following days, she began to notice similar changes in the other bells. Each one seemed to be developing additional layers to its voice, harmonics that hadn't been there before. The changes were subtle, probably undetectable to anyone who didn't work with the bells daily. But to Maria, they were unmistakable. She mentioned it to the cathedral's music director during one of their weekly meetings. Father Rossini listened politely but seemed unconcerned. "Bells are living things in their own way," he said. "They respond to weather, to the building settling, to 100 factors we don't fully understand. As long as they ring properly for services, I wouldn't worry about minor variations in tone." But Maria continued to notice the changes, and they weren't minor anymore. Each bell was developing what she could only describe as a richer vocabulary. Where once each had possessed a single, pure voice, now they seemed capable of multiple tones simultaneously, as if they were singing in harmony with themselves. The breakthrough came during her 3rd month, while she was ringing vespers on a particularly quiet evening. As the bells sang out over the Vatican grounds, Maria heard something that made her stop mid-sequence. One of the bells was ringing a response. Not an echo, she was intimately familiar with the acoustic properties of the tower. This was a deliberate answer to the pattern she had been ringing, as if the bell was engaging in conversation. Maria completed the Vespers sequence, then experimented. She rang a simple pattern on the smallest bell: 3 strikes, pause, 2 strikes, pause, 1 strike. Then she waited. After a moment of silence, the bell responded. 1 strike, pause, 2 strikes, pause, 3 strikes. The pattern reversed perfectly. Maria's hands trembled as she tried a more complex sequence. Again, the bell waited, then replied with a variation that was musically logical, as if it understood the underlying structure of what she had played. "This is impossible," she whispered to herself. But she continued the experiment, growing bolder with each exchange. The bell seemed eager to communicate, responding instantly to her queries with increasingly sophisticated answers. Over the next few nights, Maria discovered that all 7 bells were capable of this strange form of communication. Each had its own personality, some playful, some serious, one that seemed particularly wise, and another that felt almost childlike in its enthusiasm. But as the conversations continued, Maria began to understand that the bells weren't just responding to her, they were trying to tell her something. The patterns they rang weren't random musical phrases, they were stories. Maria began to transcribe the sequences, writing them down in musical notation. When she studied them later, she realized they formed coherent narratives, tales of the Vatican's history as witnessed from the bell tower. She could identify sequences that seemed to describe papal coronations, Christmas masses, Easter celebrations, moments of triumph and tragedy that had echoed through the centuries. But there were darker stories too, sequences that spoke of betrayal, of secrets hidden in Vatican archives, of things that shouldn't be remembered but couldn't be forgotten. One bell in particular seemed to carry the heaviest burden of memory. The middle bell, cast in 1654, rang patterns that filled Maria with an inexplicable sense of dread. Its stories were of plague years, of political intrigue, of sins committed within the very walls of the sacred city. Maria began to research the histories the bells were telling her. In the Vatican's vast archives, she found confirmation of many of the events they described. The bells had been present for centuries of history, witness to everything that had happened within their range of hearing. But she also found records that troubled her deeply. In 1682, a bell ringer named Brother Matteo had reported that the bells were speaking to him of things that should be buried and forgotten. He had been removed from his position and transferred to a monastery in the countryside, where he spent the rest of his life in prayer and penance. In 1743, another bell ringer had claimed the bells were possessed by the memories of the dead, and that they compelled him to ring patterns that told stories of corruption and sin within the Vatican hierarchy. He had been declared mentally unstable and confined to the Vatican's medical facilities until his death. In 1834, Brother Giuseppe Antonelli had written extensively in his personal journal about bells that remembered everything they had witnessed, and seemed determined to share those memories with anyone who would listen. His journals had been confiscated by church authorities, and Giuseppe himself had disappeared from all official records shortly thereafter. The pattern was clear. Every few decades, a bell ringer would begin to hear the voices, to understand the stories the bells were trying to tell, and each time, the church would remove them from their position, silence them, and bury their claims. Maria realized she was the latest in a long line of people who had discovered the bell's secret. But unlike her predecessors, she had the advantage of modern psychology and historical research methods. She could approach this rationally, scientifically. She began to document everything. The patterns, the bells rang, the stories they told, the historical events they referenced. She cross-referenced their accounts with official Vatican records and found disturbing discrepancies. The bells remembered things the official histories had forgotten or deliberately omitted. Scandals that had been covered up, documents that had been destroyed, people who had been erased from the records. They were living repositories of unfiltered truth. Bronze historians that had recorded everything without judgment or editing. But as Maria delved deeper into their memories, she began to understand why previous bell ringers had broken under the weight of what they learned. Some truths were too heavy for human minds to bear. The bells told her of corruption that reached to the highest levels of the church hierarchy, of documents hidden away because they contradicted official doctrine, of people who had been silenced, exiled, or worse for asking inconvenient questions. They told her of her predecessors, the bell ringers, who had heard these same stories and tried to act on them. Brother Matteo hadn't been transferred for his mental health. He had been removed because he threatened to reveal what the bells had told him about certain cardinals' activities. Brother Giuseppe hadn't disappeared. He had been murdered, his body buried in the foundations of a building that now stood in St. Peter's Square. The weight of centuries of suppressed truth pressed down on Maria like a physical force. She found herself unable to sleep, unable to eat, consumed by the knowledge the bells had shared with her. Every ring seemed to reveal new horrors, new secrets, new reasons why so many people had been willing to kill to keep these truths buried. But the bells weren't finished with their revelations. As Maria's mental state deteriorated, they began to show her the future as well as the past. They rang patterns that seemed to prophesy coming scandals, future exposures of corruption, the eventual reckoning that would come when all the buried truths finally surfaced. And they showed her something else, her own fate. In their bronze memories, Maria saw herself standing at the edge of the tower's highest window. Father Marco Benedetti had served as the bell ringer of St. Peter's Basilica for 17 years when the nightmares began. Every evening, as the last tourists departed and the great doors sealed shut, he would climb the ancient stone steps to the bell tower for his final duties of the day. The routine had become second nature. Check the mechanisms, ensure the ropes hung properly, and ring the evening call to Vespers at precisely 6 o'clock. But on the night of October 13th, 2019, something changed. As Marco pulled the rope for the sixth and final toll, the great bronze bell continued to chime. A seventh ring echoed across St. Peter's Square, then an eighth. His hands had released the rope entirely, yet the bell sang out its deep, haunting note again and again. 9, 10, 11, 12, and then, impossibly, a 13th chime. Marco stumbled backward, his weathered hands trembling as he stared up at the massive bell. In all his years, in all the centuries of tradition, the evening call had never been more than 6 chimes. The 13th chime was forbidden, an ancient superstition dating back to the founding of the Vatican itself. The next morning, Cardinal Torretti was found dead in his chambers, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but Marco noticed something the investigators missed. The cardinal's clock had stopped at exactly 6:13. Days passed, and Marco tried to convince himself it had been a mechanical failure, a simple error in the ancient system. But deep in his bones, he knew better. The bell tower had stood for over 4 centuries, its mechanisms maintained by generations of craftsmen. Nothing about the system could produce a 13th chime by accident. A week later, it happened again. This time, Marco was ready. He counted each pull of the rope. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. His hands released the hemp, but the bell continued its ancient song. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. As the final, impossible note faded into the evening air, Marco heard something that made his blood freeze. From somewhere high above, in the darkest recesses of the bell tower, came the sound of laughter. Not the joyous laughter of celebration, but something cold and ancient, filled with malice. The next morning brought news of another death. Sister Catherine, a nun who had served in the Vatican archives for 40 years, was discovered in the Sistine Chapel, collapsed beneath Michelangelo's fresco of the Last Judgment. Her final act had been to scrawl a single word in her own blood on the marble floor. 13. Marco knew he had to investigate. Armed with only a flashlight and a rosary blessed by the Pope himself, he climbed beyond the bell chamber to the forgotten levels of the tower. These upper reaches hadn't been accessed in decades, their stone steps crumbling and treacherous. Cobwebs thick as curtains barred his way, and the air grew colder with each step. At the very top, he found a small chamber he had never known existed. The walls were covered in symbols, not Christian iconography, but something far older and more sinister. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it lay an ancient leather tome bound in what looked suspiciously like human skin. The book fell open at his touch, revealing pages written in Latin so archaic that Marco could barely decipher it. But certain words were clear enough: sacrificium, damnatio, and repeated over and over, tertius decimus, the 13th. As he read by flickering flashlight, the horrible truth became clear. The bell tower had been built upon a far older foundation, a pagan temple dedicated to entities that predated Christianity by millennia. When the first stones of the Vatican were laid, the builders had unknowingly constructed their holy site atop a place of ancient power. The book spoke of a ritual, a binding that had been performed centuries ago to keep the old gods dormant. But the binding was weakening, and the 13th chime was their call to the living world. Each impossible ring was a crack in the seal, and each death that followed fed their growing power. Marco slammed the book shut, but it was too late. The knowledge was in his mind now, burning like acid. He understood why the previous bell ringers had all met mysterious ends, why none had served for more than 20 years. They had all eventually discovered this chamber, and the discovery had driven them mad. But Marco was different. He had faith, and more importantly, he had a plan. The next evening, as 6 o'clock approached, Marco prepared for his final duty as bell ringer. He had spent the day in prayer, fasting, and preparation. In his pocket was a vial of holy water blessed by 3 popes, and around his neck hung a crucifix made from wood taken from the true cross itself, a relic so sacred that only a handful existed in all the world. As he grasped the bell rope, Marco began to recite the exorcism of Saint Benedict. The Latin words echoed in the stone chamber, each syllable carefully pronounced. He pulled the rope once, crux sacra sit mihi lux, twice, non draco sit mihi dux. With each chime, his voice grew stronger, the ancient words of protection ringing out over the city. 3, 4, 5, 6. He released the rope and waited, his prayer continuing without pause. The bell remained silent for a heartbeat. Then 2. Marco dared to hope he had succeeded. Then came the 7th chime, louder than ever before. The temperature in the bell chamber plummeted, and Marco's breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air. Ice crystals formed on the bronze bell as it continued its supernatural tolling. 8, 9, 10. But Marco's prayer never faltered. He pulled out the vial of holy water and began to splash it on the bell mechanism with each forbidden chime. Where the blessed water touched the ancient bronze, it hissed and steamed as if striking red-hot metal. 11, 12. The laughter came again, but this time it was different, angry, desperate. The entities trapped between worlds could sense their binding being renewed, their power being contained once more. As the 13th chime began to sound, Marco smashed the vial of holy water directly against the great bell itself. The sound that followed was not the deep bronze tone he knew so well, but a shriek of pure rage that seemed to come from the very depths of hell. The bell cracked from top to bottom, a jagged fissure that split the ancient bronze like lightning. The sound died instantly, and with it, the presence that had haunted the tower for so long. Marco collapsed to his knees, exhausted but victorious. The binding was restored, the ancient evil contained. The Vatican's bells would ring true once more, but his victory came at a cost. The next morning, Marco was found at the base of the bell tower, his body broken on the stones of St. Peter's Square. The official report stated that he had fallen while performing maintenance, but those who knew him understood the truth. Father Marco Benedetti had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect the faithful. His final act had saved countless lives. But the entities he had bound away would not forget his interference. The Vatican appointed a new bell ringer, a young priest named Father Giuseppe. On his first evening in the tower, as he prepared to ring the call to Vespers, he noticed something strange about the great bronze bell. There was a crack running down its center, and within that crack, barely visible in the dying light, were words etched in what looked like dried blood. "The 13th waits for you all." Father Giuseppe crossed himself and began to pray, knowing that his predecessor's battle was only the first skirmish in an eternal war between light and darkness, fought in the shadows of the world's holiest place. The letter arrived at the Vatican's Apostolic Palace on a rain-soaked November morning, addressed simply to His Holiness, in handwriting that trembled with age and fear. Inside, Cardinal Mancini found 7 pages of closely written script, each word carefully formed, yet betraying the desperate haste of its composition. The letter bore no signature, but the cardinal recognized the stationery. It came from the bell tower chambers where the Vatican's ringers had lived and worked for centuries. "Your Holiness, I write this confession knowing that my earthly time grows short, and that the thing which has haunted my nights for 43 years will soon claim me, as it has claimed so many others. I can no longer bear the weight of what I have seen and done in service to God and the darker powers that dwell within these holy walls. My name was Brother Thomas Aquinas. I say was, because I am no longer certain I remain the man who first climbed these tower steps in 1976. I have served as bell ringer of St. Peter's Basilica for over 4 decades, and in that time I have witnessed things that would shake the faith of even the most devout. I came to the Vatican as a young novice, filled with the passion of youth and an unshakable belief in the righteousness of our calling. I was chosen for the bell tower because of my strong back and unwavering schedule qualities that seemed so simple and practical at the time. How naive I was to think that the position required nothing more than punctuality and physical strength. My predecessor, Brother Francis, was ancient when I arrived, a hunched figure with wild white hair and eyes that never seemed to focus on anything in this world. He spoke little during the 3 days he spent training me, communicating mostly through gestures and grunts. But on his final evening, as he prepared to retire to a monastery in the countryside, he grasped my shoulder with surprising strength and spoke words I can still hear echoing in my mind. "The bells know things, boy. They remember everything that happens within their sound. Every prayer, every sin, every secret whispered in these halls, it all resonates in the bronze. And sometimes, late at night when the Vatican sleeps, they try to tell you what they've learned." I thought he was merely old and addled. I was wrong. The first few months passed without incident. I learned the rhythms of the bells, the different calls for different occasions. The morning angelus at dawn, the call to noon prayers, the evening vespers, and the solemn toll for Compline that marked the end of each day. The work was physically demanding, but spiritually rewarding, or so I believed. It was during my 4th month in the tower that I first heard them speak. I had finished the midnight toll and was preparing to descend to my chambers when I noticed that one of the smaller bells, the one used for calling the cardinals to private audience, was swaying gently despite the absence of any wind. As I watched, it began to chime softly, so quietly that the sound barely carried beyond the bell chamber. But it wasn't the chiming that made my blood freeze. It was the voice. Emerging from the bronze itself, as clear as if someone stood beside me, I heard the whispered words, "Cardinal Rossini takes gold from the heretics, gold stained with the blood of the innocent." I fled the tower that night, convinced I was losing my mind, but the next morning brought news that Cardinal Rossini had been found dead in his chambers. A fortune in gold coins scattered around his body, and a confession of his dealings with anti-Catholic forces still clutched in his lifeless hand. The bells had spoken the truth. Over the following weeks, I began to listen more carefully to their whispered revelations. They spoke of corruption within the curia, of cardinals who sold relics to private collectors, of priests who broke their vows of celibacy and poverty. Every whisper proved accurate. Every secret they revealed was confirmed by subsequent events. I told myself I was serving God by listening to these revelations, that I was helping to purify the church from within. When the bells whispered of Bishop Marconi's embezzlement of funds meant for orphanages, I found ways to ensure the proper authorities discovered the evidence. When they spoke of Father Vittorio's unspeakable acts with the children in his care, I made certain that justice was served. But as the months turned to years, I began to realize that the bells demanded something in return for their revelations. It started small. A bell would refuse to ring unless I performed certain rituals, lighting specific candles, reciting prayers in languages that predated Christianity, sometimes fasting for days before important ceremonies. I told myself these were tests of faith, trials that God was placing before me. The truth was far more sinister. The bells were not serving God at all. They were servants of something much older, something that had been trapped within the bronze when the bells were first cast centuries ago. Each secret they revealed, each corruption they exposed, fed their growing power. They were using me as their instrument to spread chaos and distrust within the church. And I was helping them. The breaking point came in my 7th year as bell ringer. Pope John Paul I had recently died under mysterious circumstances, and the College of Cardinals had gathered to elect his successor. The bells had been whispering for weeks about the upcoming conclave, revealing the secret allegiances and hidden sins of the cardinal electors. On the night before the voting began, as I performed my evening duties, the bells began to speak with unprecedented clarity. But this time, they weren't revealing the sins of others. They were speaking of my own future. "Ring us wrong tomorrow," they whispered, their voices harmonizing in unholy chorus. "When the white smoke rises, when the new pope is announced, ring the sequence of the damned. 13 chimes, then 7, then 3. Ring the pattern, Thomas, and we will grant you power beyond imagination." The sequence of the damned, I knew it from my studies of medieval demonology, a bell pattern once used in black masses to invoke demonic powers. The bells wanted me to curse the new pope's election, to taint the entire ceremony with their evil influence. I refused. That night, the bells' whispers turned to screams. They raged and pleaded, threatened and cajoled, but I stood firm in my refusal. I spent the hours before dawn in prayer, begging God to give me strength to resist their influence. When Cardinal Wojtyla was elected Pope John Paul II, I rang the traditional pattern of celebration with hands that shook with exhaustion and fear. The bells obeyed, but their bronze voices carried a note of malice that chilled me to the bone. My defiance had consequences. From that day forward, the bells became my tormentors rather than my confederates. They would ring at random hours, disrupting the Vatican's schedule and earning me reprimands from my superiors. They would refuse to sound when needed, leaving me to explain why the call to Mass had failed to ring across St. Peter's Square. But worse than their disobedience was their new form of revelation. Instead of exposing the sins of others, they began to whisper of future tragedies, deaths that had not yet occurred, disasters that were yet to come. They spoke of the attempt on Pope John Paul II's life months before it happened. They described in detail the fall of the Berlin Wall years before the first crack appeared in the concrete. And they demanded that I act on their knowledge. "Warn the Holy Father," they would whisper. "Tell him of the Turkish assassin who will come in May. Save his life, Thomas, and we will forgive your earlier defiance." But I had learned not to trust their offers. I knew that any action I took based on their whispers would somehow serve their dark purposes. So I remained silent, even when I knew I could save lives, even when I knew my inaction would result in suffering. The guilt of my silence has eaten at my soul for decades. As the years passed, I aged far beyond my natural span. The constant exposure to the bell's malevolent influence was consuming me from within, leaving me gaunt and hollow-eyed. My hair turned white before my 40th birthday, and my hands developed a permanent tremor from the spiritual poison that flowed through the bronze I touched each day. Other bell ringers came and went. The position seemed cursed, with most lasting only a few years before requesting transfer or simply disappearing in the night. I alone remained, bound to the tower by forces I could not escape, because I had learned the terrible truth. The bells were not just influenced by evil, they were alive with it. Centuries ago, when the bells were first cast for St. Peter's Basilica, the bronze had been mixed with metal recovered from a much older source. Roman coins taken from pagan temples, golden idols melted down from conquered peoples, silver artifacts that had been used in ritual sacrifice. All of it had been incorporated into the sacred bronze in a misguided attempt to transform evil into good. But evil is not so easily transformed. It merely lies dormant, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The bells had become a prison for dozens of malevolent entities, spirits of rage and corruption that had been worshipped in the dark days before Christianity came to Rome. They whispered through the bronze, fed on the spiritual energy of the faithful who gathered below, and slowly grew in power with each passing century. And I had become their unwilling acolyte. Last week, the whispers changed again. For the first time in decades, the bells spoke not of the past or future, but of the present moment. "Your time is ending, Thomas," they said with voices like grinding metal. "We have found another to serve us, one younger and stronger than you have become. But first, you must perform one final service." They showed me visions then, horrible images of what they wanted me to do. They wanted me to ring the bells during the Pope's next public appearance, to use a specific pattern that would somehow open a gateway for their full manifestation in our world. I will not do it. I cannot do it. Instead, I write this confession as my final act of defiance. By the time you read these words, I will have destroyed the mechanism that allows the bells to be rung from the tower. I have spent weeks preparing a mixture of holy water, blessed salt, and iron filings, the only substances, I believe, capable of disrupting the malevolent forces within the bronze. I know this act will cost me my life. The bells have made that clear. But perhaps my sacrifice will buy time for someone wiser than I, to find a permanent solution to the evil that lurks within these holy towers. Forgive me, Holy Father, for my years of silence and complicity. Forgive me for the warnings I did not give, the lives I could have saved, but chose not to in order to deny the demons their victory. And please, I beg you, find someone with the knowledge and courage to properly consecrate the bells of St. Peter's. Melt them down if necessary, for they have become corrupted beyond redemption. The next bell ringer must not face what I have faced. The Church must be protected from the evil that I have enabled through my weakness and fear. May God have mercy on my soul. A servant of the tower. Cardinal Mancini finished reading the letter as the evening bells began to toll across Vatican City. But something was wrong with the sound. The familiar bronze voices were harsh and discordant, carrying undertones that made his skin crawl. He immediately ordered a search of the bell tower, but they found only an empty chamber and a pile of ash where the bell-ringing mechanism had once stood. The bells themselves remained intact, but they no longer responded to any earthly attempt to ring them. The next morning, the Vatican appointed a new bell ringer, a young priest named Father Alessandro, fresh from seminary and eager to serve. As he climbed to the tower for his first shift, he hummed a hymn and looked forward to the simple, sacred duty of calling the faithful to prayer. He did not notice that the largest bell had begun to sway gently in the windless chamber, or that words were slowly appearing in the bronze itself, etched by invisible hands. "Welcome, Alessandro. We have been waiting for you." The bells of St. Peter's had found their new servant, and their whispers began again, soft and seductive, in the darkness of the tower. The cycle would continue, as it had for centuries, until someone found the courage to silence the bronze voices forever. But that day would not come soon, for the bells had learned patience in their long captivity, and they knew that time was always on their side. Father Giuseppe had been the master bell ringer of St. Peter's Basilica for 37 years when they assigned him the boy. Marco was barely 16, thin as a communion wafer, with eyes that seemed to hold shadows deeper than the catacombs beneath the Vatican. The cardinal had insisted the boy needed guidance, direction, perhaps a calling to serve God in the ancient tradition of the campanari. "The bells are not mere instruments," Giuseppe explained on Marco's first evening, as they climbed the narrow stone steps that spiraled up into the tower's heart. "They are the voice of God Himself, calling the faithful to prayer, marking the passage of sacred time." His weathered hands traced the massive bronze surfaces of the bells, each one cast centuries ago by masters whose names were lost to history. Marco nodded, but said nothing. He rarely spoke. This strange boy only watched with those unsettling eyes as Giuseppe demonstrated the proper techniques for rope pulling, the precise timing required for the various calls to prayer. The work was physically demanding. Each bell weighed several tons, and it took considerable skill to make them sing in harmony rather than clash in cacophonous discord. For 3 weeks, Marco proved an apt student. His thin frame belied a surprising strength, and he learned the traditional sequences with an almost supernatural quickness. Giuseppe began to feel proud of his protege, thinking perhaps the cardinal had been right about the boy's potential. Then came the night of St. Lawrence's feast. Giuseppe had fallen ill with a fever that afternoon and sent word that Marco should handle the evening prayers alone. It would be his first solo performance, but the boy was ready. As twilight painted the Roman sky purple, Giuseppe lay in his small quarters below the tower, listening for the familiar bronze voices to mark the hour. But the sounds that drifted down were wrong. Instead of the measured, sacred tones he had taught Marco, Giuseppe heard something else entirely, a wild, frenzied pealing that seemed to follow no earthly rhythm. The bells rang as if possessed, their voices rising and falling in patterns that made his fever-racked mind reel. Through his small window, he could see lights beginning to flicker on throughout the Vatican, as others noticed the bizarre performance. Struggling from his bed, Giuseppe climbed the tower stairs, each step an agony. The sound grew louder, more manic, as he ascended. When he finally reached the bell chamber, what he saw froze the blood in his veins. Marco stood in the center of the room, but he was not alone. Surrounding him were figures pale, translucent shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence like candle flames in a draft. They moved with Marco in perfect synchronization, pulling ropes that weren't there, their mouths open in silent screams as the real bells thundered overhead. The boy's eyes had rolled back until only the whites showed, and his lips moved rapidly, speaking words in a language Giuseppe didn't recognize, something older than Latin, older than civilization itself. The spectral figures grew more solid with each passing moment, their features becoming clearer, the hollow cheeks of starvation, the branded marks of heresy on their foreheads, the rope burns around their necks. Giuseppe realized with growing horror that he was looking at the ghosts of the bell tower's past apprentices who had died in service, heretics who had been executed and buried in unhallowed ground beneath the foundations, plague victims whose bodies had been burned in the courtyard below, all of them drawn by Marco's strange gift, compelled to continue their endless labor, even in death. "Marco!" Giuseppe shouted over the deafening bronze chorus. "Stop this!" The boy's head turned toward him with the mechanical precision of a marionette, his rolled-back eyes somehow still managing to fix on Giuseppe's face. When he spoke, his voice was layered with the whispers of the dead. "We have waited so long for one who could hear us, who could give us form again. The bells remember everything, Father. Every soul who has served, every prayer offered, every sin confessed in their shadow. We are all here, always here, waiting to ring again." Giuseppe stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the wooden cross around his neck. The ghostly figures had turned toward him now, their expressions hungry, desperate. He understood with crystalline clarity that they wanted to add him to their number, to have his spirit join their eternal watch. As he fled down the stairs, the bells continued their mad symphony behind him, the sound seeming to follow him through the Vatican's corridors. He ran until he reached the papal apartments, where Swiss guards seized him as he pounded on the doors, raving about ghosts and possessed apprentices. When they returned to the bell tower at dawn, they found Marco collapsed on the floor, the rope still wrapped around his hands. The boy was alive, but unconscious, and remained in that state for 3 days. When he finally awoke, he claimed to remember nothing of the night in question. But Giuseppe remembered everything. He was quietly transferred to a parish in Naples, his decades of faithful service earning him a comfortable retirement far from the Vatican's bells. Marco remained as the tower's new keeper, and if the bells sometimes rang at odd hours, or if their voices carried strange harmonies that made listeners uneasy, well, such things were mysteries of faith, not to be questioned by mortal men. Giuseppe lived another 20 years, but he never again could bear the sound of church bells. On quiet evenings in Naples, when the wind was right, he swore he could still hear them, St. Peter's great bronze voices calling across the centuries, speaking in languages of the dead, reminding him that some apprenticeships never truly end. Sister Catherine had always possessed an unusual gift. From her earliest days at the convent in Assisi, she could sense the spiritual weight of objects, the accumulated prayers in rosary beads, the lingering sorrow in funeral shrouds, the joy radiating from wedding rings. When the Vatican summoned her to Rome to assist with the restoration of the ancient bell collection, she understood it was because of this sensitivity. Though such things were never spoken of directly, the work was meticulous and demanding. Each bell had to be carefully examined, its bronze surface cleaned of centuries of grime and oxidation, its internal mechanisms tested and repaired. Sister Catherine worked alongside Brother Thomas, a scholar from the Vatican's secret archives, who specialized in the history of sacred objects. Together, they cataloged each bell's provenance, documenting their makers, their dates of creation, and the purposes they had served. Most of the bells sang beautifully once restored, their voices clear and true. But there was one, a medium-sized bell cast in 1347 that refused to make any sound at all. "The clapper seems intact," Brother Thomas muttered, examining the silent bell for the dozenth time. "The bronze shows no cracks, no structural damage. By all rights, it should ring perfectly." Sister Catherine ran her hands over the bell's surface, closing her eyes to better focus her unusual perception. What she felt made her recoil instantly, a coldness so profound it seemed to leach the warmth from her very soul, and beneath it, something else. A presence. Something trapped. "There's something wrong with this bell," she whispered. Brother Thomas looked up from his notes. "Wrong how?" "It's..." She struggled to find words for what she sensed. "It's holding something. Something that doesn't want to be heard." Their research into the bell's history revealed disturbing details. It had been cast during the Black Death by a bell founder named Giacomo Toretti, whose entire family had died of plague. The records showed that Giacomo had worked alone in his foundry, refusing help, speaking to no one. When the bell was completed, he had personally delivered it to a small church outside Rome, then disappeared entirely. The church itself had been abandoned during a later outbreak of plague, its entire congregation dead within a week of the bell's installation. Every church that has housed this bell has been abandoned or destroyed within a generation, Brother Thomas noted, his voice troubled. Always following some catastrophe, plague, fire, earthquake. It's as if the bell carries a curse. Sister Catherine spent her evenings in prayer, seeking guidance about the silent bell. Her dreams became troubled, filled with visions of a medieval foundry where a man labored alone, weeping as he worked. She could see his face clearly gaunt with grief, eyes red from crying and the furnace smoke. As he poured the molten bronze, she heard him whispering words of desperate love and impossible longing. On the seventh night, the vision became clearer. Giacomo wasn't just casting a bell, he was trying to preserve something precious that the plague had taken from him. As the bronze flowed into the mold, he threw something else into the mixture. A handful of human ashes, the cremated remains of his wife and children, forbidden by church law, but made necessary by the speed of the plague's devastation. Sister Catherine woke with tears on her cheeks and the taste of bronze in her mouth. The next day, she shared her vision with Brother Thomas. His face grew pale as she described what she had seen. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then the bell contains human remains mixed with the bronze itself. It would explain why it won't ring. It's not just a bell anymore, it's a tomb. And according to church doctrine, it would be an abomination." Sister Catherine finished. "A sacred instrument contaminated by death, unable to call the faithful to prayer because its very substance is unhallowed." They brought their findings to Cardinal Bertoli, who oversaw the restoration project. The elderly cardinal listened to their report with growing unease, particularly when Brother Thomas presented the historical evidence and Sister Catherine described her visions in careful, clinical terms. "What do you recommend?" the cardinal asked. "The bell should be destroyed," Brother Thomas said firmly. "Melted down and the bronze scattered. The human remains should be given proper burial." But Sister Catherine felt differently. The bell founder wasn't trying to create an abomination. He was a father trying to keep his family close, the only way he knew how. His love for them has preserved their souls within the bronze for 7 centuries. Destroying it would be like murdering them a second time. The cardinal was silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Continue your work. I will pray for guidance." That night, alone in the workshop, Sister Catherine approached the silent bell. She placed both hands on its surface and opened her heart to whatever presence dwelled within. The response was immediate and overwhelming. She felt the weight of centuries of silence, the anguish of souls trapped between life and death, neither able to ascend to heaven nor descend to hell. But beneath the sorrow, she sensed something else, gratitude. The spirits within the bell had been waiting, hoping that someday, someone would understand. "I hear you," she whispered. "I know what you need." Over the following days, Sister Catherine prepared carefully. She fasted and prayed, purifying herself for what was to come. On the Feast of All Souls, the day when the Church recognized the communion between the living and the dead, she returned to the workshop at midnight. Standing before the silent bell, she began to sing the Dies Irae, the ancient hymn for the dead. Her voice, trained in decades of liturgical service, filled the workshop with haunting beauty. As she sang, something miraculous happened. The bell began to ring, not with the clear, bronze voice of a normal bell, but with something softer, more ethereal, a sound like wind chimes made of crystal, like the sighs of sleeping angels. As it rang, Sister Catherine saw them, the translucent figures of a woman and two small children, emerging from the bronze surface like swimmers rising from deep water. They looked at her with infinite gratitude, then turned toward a growing light that seemed to appear from nowhere. As they walked into that radiance, their forms became more solid, more real, until finally they seemed fully alive again. The woman turned back once, mouthing a silent "thank you," before disappearing into the light. In the morning, Brother Thomas found Sister Catherine collapsed beside the bell, unconscious but peaceful. When she woke, she was different, older somehow, as if the experience had aged her spirit if not her body. The bell sat silent again, but now it was the silence of peace rather than imprisonment. When Brother Thomas tested the bell later, it rang true and clear, its voice pure and beautiful. They installed it in a chapel within the Vatican itself, where it continues to call the faithful to prayer. But those with sensitive hearing sometimes detect an unusual quality to its voice, a warmth and tenderness that speaks not just of divine love, but of human love, so strong it transcends death itself. Sister Catherine never spoke in detail about what she had experienced that night. But sometimes, when the bell rang for evening vespers, she would smile and whisper a prayer for a medieval bell founder whose love for his family had created something miraculous, a bridge between the living and the dead, built of bronze and sorrow and hope that refused to die. Father Martinez had heard 10,000 confessions in his 30 years as a priest, but he had never heard one that followed him home like a living thing. It began the week he was assigned to assist with the bell tower maintenance at St. Peter's routine work, inspecting the rope mechanisms and ensuring the ancient pulleys remained in good repair. The Vatican's bell tower was a maze of catwalks and chambers, some dating back centuries, with acoustic properties that could carry whispers from one level to another in unexpected ways. It was while working alone in the upper chamber that he first heard the voice. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." Father Martinez looked around, confused. The nearest confessional was 3 floors below, and the thick stone walls should have prevented any sound from traveling this far. Yet the voice had been clear, spoken in Latin with an accent he couldn't place, something archaic, perhaps medieval. "Hello," he called out. "Is someone there?" Only silence answered. He returned to his work, checking the massive support beams that held the great bells in place. The voice came again, fainter this time but unmistakably real. "It has been 700 years since my last confession." This time, Father Martinez dropped his tools. 700 years? It had to be someone playing a prank, though he couldn't imagine how or why. The bell tower was supposed to be empty except for him. "Father, I cannot rest. The weight of my sin presses upon me like stone." The voice seemed to emanate from the bells themselves, as if the bronze were speaking. Father Martinez approached the largest bell, placing his ear against its surface. The metal was cold beneath his touch, but he could swear he felt a faint vibration, like a heartbeat made of whispers. "I was the bell ringer here when Clement V ruled. My name was Brother Angelo, and I committed the sin of murder within these sacred walls." Against his better judgment, Father Martinez found himself responding, "What happened, my son?" The story that followed, whispered from the bronze in a voice like wind through ancient stone, was one of love, jealousy, and betrayal. Brother Angelo had been the tower's keeper in the early 14th century, during a time of political upheaval within the church. He had fallen in love with a young woman who came to clean the papal apartments, Elena, whose beauty was matched only by her piety. But Elena had attracted another admirer, Cardinal Torriani, a man of wealth and power who was accustomed to taking what he desired. When Elena rejected his advances, citing her commitment to Brother Angelo, the cardinal had her arrested on false charges of theft. She was to be executed the following dawn. "I could not let her die for my sins," the voice whispered from the bell. "So I went to the cardinal's chambers that night, intending to plead for her life. But when I found him there, drunk and laughing about her fate, speaking of how he would watch her burn come morning, something broke within me." Father Martinez shivered, though the tower was warm from the afternoon sun. "What did you do?" "I strangled him with a bell rope, watched the light fade from his eyes as I had seen it fade from so many others in that terrible time. Then I took his body and sealed it within the wall of this very tower, behind the space where we store the ropes." The confession continued, each word carrying the weight of centuries. Brother Angelo had saved Elena's life, but his crime was discovered within days. Rather than face execution, he had climbed to the top of the bell tower and thrown himself from its height, his body shattered on the stones below. "But death brought no peace," the voice lamented. "My soul cannot rest while my sin remains unconfessed, unabsolved. I have waited 700 years for a priest who could hear me, who could grant me the forgiveness I need to find rest." Father Martinez felt the familiar weight of the confessional settling on his shoulders. This was either an elaborate hoax or something far beyond his understanding. But his duty was clear. "Do you repent of this sin?" "With every fiber of my being. Not a day passes that I do not regret taking that life, no matter how justified it seemed." "And have you performed penance?" 7 centuries of watching, Father. 700 years of ringing the bells for prayers I cannot share, calling the faithful to masses I cannot attend, marking the hours of a life I no longer live. If that is not penance enough, tell me what more I must do." Father Martinez closed his eyes and spoke the ancient words of absolution, his voice echoing strangely in the bronze chamber. As he spoke, he felt a change in the air, a lightness, as if some tremendous pressure had been released. "Thank you," came the whisper, fainter now. "Look behind the rope storage, Father. Grant him proper burial, and my rest will be complete." The voice faded, leaving only the normal sounds of the tower wind through stone, the distant murmur of Rome beyond the Vatican walls. The next day, Father Martinez returned with Brother Giuseppe from the maintenance crew. Together, they examined the wall behind the rope storage area. The stones there were different from the rest, older, fitted together with medieval mortar. Using careful archaeological techniques, they removed several stones and found what Brother Angelo had described: a skeleton, dressed in the rotting remains of 14th century cardinal's robes, still wearing a gold ring bearing the seal of Cardinal Torriani. The discovery created a sensation within the Vatican. Historians confirmed that Cardinal Torriani had indeed disappeared mysteriously in 1314, and records showed that a bell ringer named Brother Angelo had died by suicide around the same time. The cardinal's remains were given proper burial in the papal crypts, while Brother Angelo was posthumously granted absolution and interred in the consecrated ground of the Vatican cemetery. But the strangest part came later. Father Martinez continued his work in the bell tower, but the acoustic anomalies had changed. Instead of whispers of confession, he now sometimes heard different sounds, laughter, gentle and peaceful, usually accompanied by what sounded like a woman's voice singing hymns in an archaic dialect. Brother Giuseppe, who had worked in the tower for decades, confirmed that these sounds were new. "It's as if the tower itself is happier," he said one afternoon as they listened to the distant echo of singing. "The bells ring truer now, more beautiful. Whatever you did up there, Father, it was good work." Father Martinez never spoke publicly about his supernatural confession, but sometimes, during quiet moments in his own confessional booth, he would remember Brother Angelo's words and feel a deep gratitude for the Church's teachings about redemption and forgiveness. Some sins, he had learned, are so heavy that they require centuries to lift. But no soul is beyond the reach of God's mercy, not even those who must wait 700 years to receive it. The bells of St. Peter's continued to ring the hours, calling the faithful to prayer and marking the passage of sacred time. And if their voices sometimes carry notes of joy that seem to echo from another century, well, perhaps that is simply the sound of two souls, finally at peace, sharing their happiness with all who have ears to hear. Professor Hendrik Valdez had spent his entire academic career studying the mathematical principles of campanology, the science of bell ringing. When the Vatican invited him to Rome to investigate an acoustic anomaly in their historical bell collection, he expected to spend a few weeks solving a minor mystery about overtones or resonance frequencies. He did not expect to encounter something that would challenge his understanding of time itself. The problem bell was kept in the restoration workshop beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Cast in 1456 by the master founder Pietro Vanini, it had been removed from active service in 1623, after what the archives described only as irregular behavior. For 4 centuries, it had sat silent in storage, too historically valuable to destroy but too problematic to use. The issue is complex, explained Dr. Rossetti from the Vatican Museums as she led Professor Valdez through the underground chambers. When this bell rings, the sound appears to arrive before the bell is struck. Our measurements suggest the acoustic signature begins approximately 3.2 seconds before any physical contact with the bronze. Professor Valdez adjusted his recording equipment, skeptical but intrigued. That's impossible. Sound cannot travel backward through time. Nevertheless, it happens. Every time. The bell itself was magnificent, a work of Renaissance artistry covered in intricate religious scenes cast in relief. Saints and angels danced around its circumference, their faces showing expressions of rapture that seemed almost alive in the workshop's subtle lighting. At the bell's crown, an inscription in Latin read, Tempus Domini est. Time belongs to the Lord. Has anyone examined the bell's internal structure? Professor Valdez asked, running his hands over the elaborate decorations. Several experts over the centuries. The bronze composition is standard for its era. The shape is mathematically perfect for sound production. There's nothing unusual about the physical bell itself. But as Professor Valdez began his detailed analysis, he discovered that wasn't entirely true. Hidden within the intricate relief work, almost invisible unless examined with magnification, were additional symbols, not Christian iconography but something far older. Mathematical notations that predated modern calculus by centuries, astronomical charts showing celestial movements with impossible accuracy, and strangest of all, what appeared to be mechanical diagrams of gears and wheels that wouldn't be invented for another 200 years. Dr. Rossetti, he called, his voice tight with excitement. Look at this. Through his magnifying lens, she saw what he had found. A tiny engraving hidden behind the robes of a carved angel. It showed a bell suspended within what appeared to be a complex astronomical device, surrounded by rotating rings marked with incomprehensible calculations. What is it? She whispered. I believe it's a temporal mechanism. Pietro Vanini wasn't just casting a bell, he was creating a device to manipulate time itself. Their research into Vanini's life revealed a man far ahead of his era. He had corresponded with early astronomers, studied under alchemists who claimed to understand the fundamental nature of time, and spent decades trying to create what he called bronze that could sing to yesterday. His workshop notes, preserved in the Vatican secret archives, spoke of his obsession with creating a bell that could call across the centuries, summoning prayers from past and future alike. The critical breakthrough came when Professor Valdez discovered Vanini's final journal entry, written the night before he delivered the completed bell to the Vatican. In fading Latin script, the master founder had written, I have succeeded beyond my wildest dreams and my deepest fears. The bronze sings backward through time, but in doing so, it shows me visions I was never meant to see. Tonight I beheld my own death, watched it echo backward from some future moment until it reached me here in my workshop. The bell does not merely ring backward, it reveals the future by pulling it into the past. May God forgive me for what I have created. Vanini had died that very night, found dead in his workshop with no apparent cause. The bell had been delivered to the Vatican by his apprentices, who reported that their master had seemed haunted, in his final days. Professor Valdez's initial test of the bell confirmed the impossible. When he struck it with a soft mallet, the sound began 3.2 seconds before contact, building to a crescendo at the moment of impact, then fading normally. But more disturbing were the additional sounds captured by his sensitive recording equipment, whispers in Latin, spoken in voices from across the centuries. The prayers, he realized. Playing back the recording for Dr. Rossetti. The bell is collecting prayers from the future and playing them in the past. Listen, that's the voice of Pope Julius III, who wouldn't become pope for 30 years after this bell was cast. As they continued their analysis, the phenomenon became more pronounced. Each time the bell was rung, it seemed to capture more temporal echoes, fragments of conversations, prayers, and ceremonies from decades or even centuries in the future. Professor Valdez began to recognize patterns in the chaos, specific voices recurring across different time periods. And then he heard his own voice. It came during their 15th test. A fragment of conversation played backward through the bronze discovered the temporal mechanism. The bell must be destroyed before the recording cut off, but the implication was clear. At some point in the future, Professor Valdez would recommend destroying the bell. But why? The answer came 3 days later, during what was supposed to be their final test. As Professor Valdez struck the bell, something unprecedented happened. Instead of just playing sounds from the future, the bell began to project images, ghostly, translucent scenes that flickered in the air around them, like mirages made of light and time. They saw the Vatican as it would be centuries in the future, different buildings, unfamiliar faces, technologies that didn't yet exist. But they also saw something else. Darkness spreading through the holy city like a plague. Shadows that moved with malevolent intelligence, consuming everything they touched. And at the center of it all stood the bell, ringing continuously, its backward song somehow feeding the encroaching darkness. "It's not just showing us the future," Professor Valdez whispered, his face pale with horror. "It's creating it. Each time we ring it, we're pulling pieces of tomorrow into today, disrupting the natural flow of time. And that disruption is creating cracks, spaces where something else can enter." Dr. Rossetti saw it too. The shadows weren't empty darkness, but something alive, hungry, patient, something that existed outside of normal time and had been waiting for exactly this kind of temporal wound to slip through. The visions faded as the bell's song ended, but both researchers knew they had seen the truth. Vanini's masterpiece was beautiful and brilliant and utterly dangerous, a temporal trap that would eventually tear holes in reality itself. "The bell must be destroyed," Professor Valdez said, echoing the words they had heard from his future self. But as they moved toward the bell, intending to remove it from its stand, it began to ring on its own, a mournful, backward song that seemed to plead for its continued existence. In that sound, they heard centuries of accumulated prayers, the voices of saints and sinners, popes and pilgrims, all bound together in bronze, that had learned to dream. "How do we destroy something that exists partially in the future?" Dr. Rossetti asked. Professor Valdez smiled grimly. "Very carefully, and with a great deal of prayer." They spent the following week in preparation, consulting with theologians, physicists, and historians. The destruction had to be perfect, total dissolution of the bronze, while simultaneously severing its temporal connections. They settled on a combination of extreme heat and electromagnetic pulses, designed to break apart both the physical metal and the temporal field it generated. On the chosen morning, they gathered in the workshop with a small team of Vatican officials and scientists. As they prepared to begin the process, the bell rang one final time on its own, a pure, clear note that seemed to contain gratitude as well as farewell. In that last song, Professor Valdez heard something that made him pause. Children's laughter from some distant tomorrow. The sound of joy and innocence that would exist only if the darkness never came. The bell's destruction was swift and complete. The bronze dissolved in moments, its temporal field collapsing with a sound like sighing wind. When the process was finished, nothing remained but a small pile of ordinary metal dust. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, those who work in the Vatican's restoration workshops report hearing something impossible. The echo of a bell that no longer exists, ringing backward through time, carrying prayers from a future that will now never come to pass. Professor Valdez returned to his university, But his research took a new direction. He spent his remaining years studying not how to manipulate time, but how to protect it, developing theoretical frameworks for temporal stability and publishing papers on the dangers of chronological experimentation that most of his colleagues dismissed as science fiction. But he knew the truth. Time is not a river flowing in one direction, but an ocean with currents and depths that mortals were never meant to explore. And somewhere in that vast temporal sea, the consciousness of Pietro Vanini's bell still rings backward through the centuries, a warning to future generations about the price of playing God with time itself. The Vatican's bells continue to mark the hours in their ancient fashion, calling the faithful to prayer and celebration, but they ring only forward now, as God intended, carrying their bronze voices toward tomorrow instead of yesterday. And in that simple progression of sound through time, there is both safety and grace, the assurance that some boundaries are meant to remain unbroken, and some songs are too dangerous to sing. Brother Marcus had always been drawn to silence. It was what led him to the Vatican in the first place, the promise of contemplative quiet, of finding God in the spaces between words. So when Cardinal Torretti approached him about becoming the new bell ringer for St. Peter's Basilica, Marcus felt a peculiar irony in the assignment. The previous bell ringer, Brother Paolo, passed away quite suddenly, the cardinal explained, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as they walked through the marble corridors. We need someone reliable, someone who understands the sacred nature of the calling. Marcus nodded, though he wondered what could be so sacred about pulling ropes at appointed times. Still, he had taken vows of obedience, and if this was where God wanted him, he would serve faithfully. The bell tower was accessed through a narrow stone staircase that spiraled upward from the basilica's main structure. Marcus counted 237 steps on his first ascent, his breathing heavy by the time he reached the cramped chamber that would become his daily workplace. 12 massive bronze bells hung in their wooden framework, each one bearing Latin inscriptions worn smooth by centuries of use. The schedule is quite specific, Cardinal Torretti explained, producing a leather-bound journal from his robes. Each bell has its purpose: matins, lauds, prime, and so forth. The times are marked here, along with the particular sequences required for different feast days and solemnities. Marcus accepted the journal, noting how the pages fell open naturally to certain sections, as if they had been consulted countless times. The previous bell ringer's handwriting filled the margins with notes: third bell sticks in damp weather, and extra pull needed for Ave Maria sequence. What struck Marcus as odd, however, was a recurring notation that appeared throughout the journal: never the 13th bell. The words appeared at least 20 times, sometimes underlined multiple times, occasionally written in what looked like red ink. "Cardinal," Marcus ventured, "I count only 12 bells here. What does this note about a 13th bell mean?" The cardinal's face darkened almost imperceptibly. Brother Paolo was eccentric in his later years. The isolation of the bell tower can affect some men strangely. Pay no attention to his ravings. But Marcus couldn't shake his curiosity. That first week, as he learned the rhythms and requirements of his new position, he found himself studying every inch of the bell chamber. The 12 bells were arranged in a semicircle, their bronze surfaces gleaming in the afternoon light that streamed through the tower's narrow windows. Yet there was something about the arrangement that seemed incomplete, as if waiting for something to fill a gap that Marcus couldn't quite identify. It was on his 8th night that Marcus first heard it. He had stayed late, practicing the complex sequence required for the Feast of St. Lawrence, when a sound drifted up from somewhere below the main bell chamber. At first, he thought it might be whined through the tower's stone passages, but as he paused his work and listened more carefully, he realized it was the deep, resonant tone of a bell, but not one of his 12 bells. This sound was deeper, more haunting, a note that seemed to vibrate not just through the air but through his very bones. Marcus felt his skin prickle as the tone held for nearly 30 seconds before fading into silence. He descended the stairs cautiously, checking each level of the tower for some explanation. The lower chambers contained old ropes, spare parts for the bell mechanisms, and decades of accumulated dust and debris, but no 13th bell. The next morning, Marcus approached Father Benedetti, the elderly priest who served as the tower's unofficial historian. "Ah," "You've heard it then," Father Benedetti said without surprise, looking up from the breviary he was reading in the small garden behind the basilica. "I wondered how long it would take." "Heard what, Father?" "The campana dannata, the damned bell." Father Benedetti closed his breviary and gestured for Marcus to sit on the stone bench beside him. It was cast in 1534 by one of the finest bell makers in Italy, Antonio Scamorza. But something went wrong during the blessing ceremony. Marcus leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. Cardinal Farnese himself was to consecrate the bell, along with the other 12 that were being installed that year. But when they reached the 13th bell, something happened. The official records are vague. There was talk of an accident, of the cardinal being injured. Some witnesses claimed the bell rang by itself during the consecration, though that's impossible, of course. What happened to the bell? Father Benedetti was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dome of St. Peter's rising above them. They sealed it away, somewhere in the lower chambers of the tower, walled up and forgotten. At least, that was the intention. "But you're saying it still rings?" "I'm saying that many bell ringers over the centuries have reported hearing it. Not all of them, mind you, perhaps 1 in every 3 or 4. Brother Paolo was quite troubled by it in his final months. He became convinced that the bell was calling to him, that it wanted to be freed." Marcus felt a chill despite the warm morning sun. "And what do you think, Father?" "I think there are some things in this world that are better left undisturbed. Some things that we seal away for good reason." Father Benedetti reopened his breviary, signaling the end of their conversation. "You would do well to focus on your 12 bells, Brother Marcus. They provide more than enough work for any faithful servant." But Marcus found it increasingly difficult to focus on anything else. Over the next several weeks, the sound came more frequently sometimes during his regular bell-ringing duties, sometimes in the deep hours of the night when he would wake in his cell to hear that haunting tone drifting across the Vatican grounds. He began staying later in the tower, ostensibly to practice difficult sequences, but really to explore. Armed with candles and a growing obsession, Marcus investigated every stone, every timber, every corner of the tower's lower levels. The walls were thick in some places, over 6 feet of solid stone, but sound had a way of finding the smallest gaps. It was while examining the tower's foundation level that Marcus discovered the inconsistency. The chamber was roughly circular, following the tower's outer walls, but one section seemed smaller than it should be. Pacing off the dimensions and comparing them to the levels above, Marcus calculated that approximately 8 feet of space was unaccounted for. His candle flame flickered as he ran his hands along the suspect wall. The stones were the same as the rest of the foundation, worn smooth by age, but the mortar between them was different, slightly newer, though still centuries old. And here, pressed against the wall, the sound of the 13th bell was stronger. Marcus found the loose stone 3 days later. It was smaller than the others, placed near the floor where it would be easy to overlook. When he worked it free with his knife, candlelight revealed a narrow gap just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The space beyond was cramped and thick with dust that made Marcus cough as he crawled forward. His candle illuminated rough stone walls and timber supports. And ahead of him, a chamber that opened into a space tall enough to stand in. The 13th bell hung in perfect silence, suspended from a wooden framework that looked identical to those supporting the 12 bells above. But this bell was different. Even in the wavering candlelight, Marcus could see that its bronze surface was covered in symbols that weren't quite like any religious iconography he recognized. The Latin inscriptions that adorned the other bells were replaced here by text in what might have been Hebrew or Aramaic or something far older. The bell's clapper had been removed, which explained why it couldn't ring in any conventional sense. Yet as Marcus approached, he could swear he felt vibrations in the air around it, as if it were somehow resonating without making sound that human ears could detect. A leather journal lay on a small wooden table beside the bell, its pages yellowed with age. Marcus opened it carefully, recognizing Brother Paolo's handwriting on the first page. "It speaks to me now, not in words, but in something deeper. The dreams have become more vivid. I see the city burning, the faithful screaming, darkness pouring forth from the very stones of St. Peter's itself. The bell wants to be heard. It needs to be heard. But I understand now why they sealed it away. Some calls should never be answered." The entries grew increasingly erratic as Marcus flipped through the pages. Tried to leave today, but my feet wouldn't carry me past the tower's base. It's claiming me, just as it claimed Scamorza, just as it claimed the cardinal who tried to bless it. I understand the pattern now. Every bell ringer eventually finds this place, and every bell ringer who finds it becomes part of it. The symbols are moving. I know that's impossible, but they shift when I'm not looking directly at them. They're not Latin, not Hebrew, they're something from before, from the time when this ground was sacred to older gods than ours. I replaced the clapper today. I had to. The dreams were becoming unbearable, and the only way to make them stop is to let it ring, just once, and then perhaps I can have peace. The final entry was dated only 3 days before Brother Paolo's death. It's done. The bell has rung, and I understand everything now. The consecration in 1534 wasn't interrupted by accident. It was interrupted by revelation. Cardinal Farnese saw what would happen if the bell was allowed to complete the blessing, and he ordered it sealed away. But sealing it away only delayed the inevitable. Every bell ringer finds it eventually, and every bell ringer makes the same choice I'm about to make. The pattern must continue. The bell must be served. And when I'm gone, another will come, and another after that, until the day when one of us is strong enough to let it ring properly, to let it call out across the world as it was meant to do. Marcus slammed the journal shut, his hands trembling. In the candlelight, the symbols on the bell's surface seemed to writhe and shift, and he could swear he heard a low humming sound emanating from the bronze itself. He should leave. He should seal the loose stone back in place and never return. He should destroy the journal and pretend he had never found this hidden chamber. Instead, Marcus found himself reaching for the iron clapper that lay on the table beside the journal. The metal was warm to the touch, as if it had recently been heated. As his fingers closed around it, images flashed through his mind, not memories, but visions of things that had never been but might yet come to pass. He saw St. Peter's Basilica cracking along its foundations, saw the faithful fleeing in terror as something ancient and terrible rose from beneath the Vatican's hallowed ground. He saw cities burning, saw the sky itself seeming to tear open, and through it all, he heard the sound of the 13th bell, calling out across the world with a voice that demanded to be answered. When the visions faded, Marcus found himself standing before the bell, the clapper in his hand. He knew what would happen if he attached it. He knew what Paolo had known, what every bell ringer before him had discovered in this hidden chamber. But he also knew that he had no choice. The bell had been calling to him since his first night in the tower, and now that he had found it, the calling was too strong to resist. With steady hands, despite the terror flooding through his mind, Marcus secured the clapper to the bell's interior. The first toll rang out with impossible volume, seeming to shake the very foundations of the Vatican. Dust rained from the ceiling of the hidden chamber as the second toll followed. Then the third. By the fourth toll, Marcus could hear screams echoing from somewhere above the faithful in the basilica, responding to a sound that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. By the seventh toll, Marcus understood that he had become part of something far older and more terrible than the Christian faith he had devoted his life to serving. The symbols on the bell's surface were glowing now, and through the stone walls around him he could see light, not the warm light of candles or electricity, but something cold and ancient and utterly wrong. The 13th and final toll rang out across Vatican City just as dawn was breaking. By the time the Swiss guard reached the bell tower, they found only 11 bells in the upper chamber. The 12th had somehow vanished, and Brother Marcus was nowhere to be found. Cardinal Toretti ordered the tower sealed for structural repairs that would last 6 months. When it reopened, a new bell ringer was installed. Brother Francis, a young man from Ireland who had specifically requested the position for its promise of solitary contemplation. It took Brother Francis exactly 8 days to hear the first sound of the 13th bell. Sister Catherine had been dead for 3 months when she began ringing the bells again. Father Alessandro discovered this impossible fact at 3:17 a.m. on a cold October morning. When the sound of the Angelus sequence woke him from uneasy sleep, the bells of Santa Maria Maggiore were ringing in perfect order, the traditional 3 sets of 3 tolls, followed by the longer sequence that called the faithful to prayer. The only problem was that Sister Catherine had been the only person who knew that particular sequence, and Sister Catherine was buried in the cemetery behind the basilica, her body committed to earth with all appropriate rites and ceremonies 3 months prior. Alessandro pulled on his cassock and made his way through the darkened corridors of the rectory, his bare feet silent on the cold stone floors. The basilica was empty, as he had expected, but moonlight streaming through the stained glass windows cast strange patterns on the marble floors, shadows that seemed to shift and move as he passed. The bell tower was accessible through a door behind the main altar, and Alessandro climbed the narrow spiral staircase with growing trepidation. Each step brought him closer to the bell chamber, and with each step, he became more certain that he would find it empty, which, of course, he did. The 5 bells of Santa Maria Maggiore hung in their wooden framework, their bronze surfaces reflecting the pale moonlight that filtered through the chamber's narrow windows. The ropes that controlled them hung motionless, yet Alessandro could swear he still heard the echo of their ringing in the air around him. He was examining the ropes for some sign of recent disturbance, when he noticed the notebook. It sat on the small wooden stool that Sister Catherine had used during her 30 years as the basilica's bell ringer, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. Alessandro had never seen it before, which was strange. He had been the one to clean out Sister Catherine's few belongings after her death, and this notebook hadn't been among them. The first page bore Sister Catherine's distinctive handwriting, but the date at the top was from last week. They tell me I'm dead, but the bells still need to ring. Death is such a limiting concept, don't you think? As if our service to God ends simply because our hearts stop beating. The bells know better. They remember every hand that has pulled their ropes, every sequence that has been rung in their honor. They hold all of us within themselves, every bell ringer who has ever served, going back to the very beginning. Alessandro turned the page with trembling fingers. Father Alessandro will find this notebook soon. I can see him climbing the stairs, can feel his confusion and fear. Poor man. He thinks death is an ending, when it's really just another kind of beginning. I tried to explain this to him during my final weeks, but he couldn't understand. How could he? He's never heard the bells speaking, never felt them calling his name in the hours before dawn. The handwriting on the 3rd page was different, older, more formal. I am Sister Margaret, and I served these bells from 1923 until my death in 1951. Sister Catherine speaks truth. We do not leave our posts simply because our bodies fail us. The bells bind us, hold us, keep us in service. It is not a curse, though it may seem so to those who do not understand. It is the greatest blessing God can bestow: eternal service, eternal purpose. Another hand had written below that, Brother Thomas, 1887, 1922. The bells remember us all. And below that, in handwriting so faded it was barely legible, Father Giuseppe, 1834, 1886. The bells are eternal. We are eternal in them. Alessandro flipped through page after page of similar entries, each one signed by a different bell ringer, each one dated after their death. The notebook contained entries spanning nearly 2 centuries, all of them written by people who should have been unable to write anything at all. The final entry was dated that very night. Sister Catherine again. Father Alessandro, if you are reading this, and I know you are, you must understand something very important. The bells are not instruments. They are repositories. They hold memory. They hold souls. They hold the essence of everyone who has ever served them. And once you begin to serve them, once you truly hear their call, you become part of that repository forever. You will try to leave now. You will tell yourself this is impossible, that dead people cannot write in notebooks or ring bells in the night. You will convince yourself that you are having a breakdown, that stress and grief have affected your mind, but you will return. Tomorrow night, or the night after, or the night after that. The bells will call to you, just as they called to me, just as they have called to every faithful servant. And when you answer that call, when you take up the ropes and learn the sequences, you will understand. The bells do not release their servants. Death is simply a transition to a deeper form of service. Alessandro dropped the notebook as if it had burst into flames. The sound of its impact on the wooden floor seemed to echo strangely in the bell chamber, as if the bronze surfaces above were somehow amplifying and distorting it. He ran down the spiral staircase, through the empty basilica, across the marble floors that now seemed to gleam with an inner light. He ran until he reached his quarters, where he locked the door behind him and sat on his narrow bed, breathing heavily and trying to convince himself that he had experienced some kind of waking nightmare. But even as he attempted to rationalize what he had seen, Alessandro could hear them in the distance, the bells of Santa Maria Maggiore ringing out across the sleeping city in sequences that no living person knew how to perform. The next morning brought no comfort. Alessandro approached the bell tower with the intention of removing the notebook, of disposing of this evidence of whatever was happening. But when he reached the bell chamber, he found nothing. No notebook, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. Yet that afternoon, when the time came for Vespers, the bells rang by themselves. Alessandro stood in the main body of the basilica, watching the few faithful who had come for evening prayer, and listened as the correct sequence played out above them. The congregation seemed to notice nothing unusual. Why would they? The bells were ringing at the proper time, in the proper manner. Only Alessandro knew that no human hand was pulling those ropes. This pattern continued for days. The bells rang at all appropriate times, always in the correct sequences, always with perfect timing. Alessandro told himself he should be grateful the basilica needed a bell ringer, and apparently his prayers had been answered in a most unusual way. But the gratitude curdled into unease as the weeks passed. Alessandro began to notice things. Small things at first, a rope swaying slightly after the bells had finished ringing. A wooden stool moved a few inches from where he remembered it being. Then larger things. The sound of footsteps in the bell tower, when he knew it was empty. The faint scent of the lavender soap Sister Catherine had used. Shadows moving in the chamber above when moonlight streamed through the windows. 1 month after finding the notebook, Alessandro forced himself to return to the bell chamber at night. This time, he brought his own notebook and pen. He didn't have to wait long. At precisely midnight, the bells began to ring, not one of the standard sequences, but something new, something complex and beautiful that seemed to weave together melodies Alessandro had never heard before. And as they rang, words appeared on the blank page of his notebook, written in Sister Catherine's familiar hand. "You came back. I knew you would. The bells have been telling me about you, Father Alessandro. They like you. They think you could be a worthy successor." Alessandro found himself writing a response, though he couldn't have said why. Successor to what? "You're dead, sister. This is impossible." Dead is such a narrow word. I prefer to think of myself as having expanded into a new form of existence. The bells hold us, Father. They keep us safe, keep us purposeful. When my body failed, I didn't disappear. I became part of something larger, something eternal. This is insanity. I'm losing my mind. Your mind is fine, Father. It's your perception that's changing. You're beginning to hear what the bells have always been saying, to see what they have always been showing us. Every bell ringer goes through this process. Some fight it longer than others, but all of us eventually understand. The writing in the notebook paused, and Alessandro heard footsteps on the wooden floor of the bell chamber. When he looked up, he saw her. Sister Catherine stood beside the largest bell, her form translucent but unmistakably real. She looked exactly as she had in life, a small, elderly woman with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of decades spent pulling ropes and maintaining the ancient mechanisms. She was smiling. "You can see me," she said, and her voice seemed to come from the bells themselves. "That means you're ready for the next stage." "This is impossible," Alessandro whispered. "Is it? You've been hearing us ring the bells every day for a month. You've seen the notebook appear and disappear. You felt us moving through the tower at night. At what point does impossible become simply unexpected?" Sister Catherine moved closer, and Alessandro could see that there were others with her, translucent figures that he recognized from old photographs in the basilica's archives. Sister Margaret, who had served from the 1920s until the 1950s. Brother Thomas, whose tenure had ended in 1922. Father Giuseppe, whose weathered face Alessandro knew from a painting in the rectory. "We are all here," Sister Catherine said. "We have all been waiting for you to understand. The bells don't just make music, Father. They make connections. They link the living and the dead, the past and the present. They create a community of service that transcends death itself." "But why me?" Alessandro asked. "I never wanted to be a bell ringer. I'm a priest, not a whatever this is." "The bells choose," Sister Margaret said, her voice a whisper that somehow filled the chamber. "They have been calling to you since the day you arrived at Santa Maria Maggiore. We have simply been waiting for you to answer." Alessandro looked around the bell chamber, at the bronze surfaces that seemed to gleam with their own inner light, at the faces of the dead who stood before him as real as anything he had ever seen. He thought about the month that had passed, about the way the bells had continued their service without any living hand to guide them, about the strange comfort he had begun to feel when he heard them ringing in the distance. "What would happen if I said no?" he asked. "You could try," Brother Thomas said. "Some have tried, but the bells are patient. They will continue to call, and eventually you will answer. It's easier if you don't fight it." "And if I said yes?" "Then you would begin to learn," Sister Catherine said. "The true sequences, the deep harmonies, the ways in which the bells speak to each other and to us. You would become part of our community, our eternal service. And someday, when your body fails as all bodies must, you would continue that service in a new form." Alessandro closed his notebook and set down his pen. Around him, the dead bell ringers waited patiently, their faces kind and understanding. Above him, the bells hung silent in their framework, but he could feel them humming with potential energy, with centuries of accumulated purpose. "Show me," he said finally. Sister Catherine smiled and gestured toward the ropes. "The first lesson is always the same," she said. "Learn to listen. The bells will tell you everything you need to know." As Alessandro reached for the rope of the smallest bell, he felt something settle into place within him, a sense of rightness, of belonging, of purpose that he had never experienced before. The rope was warm in his hands, despite the cold October air, and when he pulled it, the bell's voice rang out clear and true across the sleeping city. But beneath that sound, Alessandro heard something else, voices, dozens of them, welcoming him to a community that stretched back centuries and would continue for centuries to come. The bells of Santa Maria Maggiore had found their new ringer, and they would never let him go. 6 months later, when Father Giovanni arrived to take over Alessandro's duties at the Basilica, he was surprised to learn that no bell ringer had been assigned to replace Sister Catherine. Yet the bells rang punctually, beautifully, in sequences that seemed more complex and meaningful than anything he had heard before. It was only when he found Alessandro's notebook, hidden beneath loose floorboards in the bell chamber, that Father Giovanni began to understand the truth. And by then, of course, it was too late. The bells had already begun calling his name.